Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker.
And this is David McKerracher. You're listening to Why Left?
So today on Why Left, we're going to be talking about Greenland and later on the Agora. But
Mm-hmm.
first, Greenland. Donald Trump has been talking about potentially taking control of Greenland. Should the United States possess Greenland? Would Greenland want to be part of the United States? And he's also been talking this way a little bit about Canada and even about Mexico, or at least the Gulf of Mexico, which has been referred to as the Gulf of America. Why isn't it the Gulf of America is the question that
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump has been asking. Now, I don't know if that's just in reference to the name or if there is some kind of territorial claim at which that gestures, but either way, it's a lot of talk about expansion, expanding the United States. And this is something that upsets some people and it gets other people very excited. And so it's one of those questions that really activates certain things in people and allows you to see where their instincts lie. And I think it's one of those issues that very much brushes up against, in left-wing spaces, this Western Marxist, Eastern Marxist, imperialist, anti-imperialist thing that
Right.
people have been talking about so much lately. Is the problem capitalism or is it the United States?
Right. Well, there's an interesting thing I keep hearing, which is that Europe had capitalism, but the United States is capitalism. Have you heard that one?
I've heard people make that kind of claim. And this argument that capitalism is a state as opposed to an economic system, or which identifies very heavily the economic system with the state, such that the expansion of the state is taken to be the expansion of capitalism and therefore inherently nefarious. I think it's a very curious move that some people make. Uh, because if you aren't making that move, then there's a question to be asked, a set of questions that you might ask. Do people in Greenland want to be part of the United States? Would it benefit people in Greenland to become part of the United States? Would it benefit Americans for Greenland to become part of the United States? These are questions that people don't seem to want to discuss. And they don't seem to want to discuss them because all of those questions are precluded by a belief that American expansion is necessarily evil.
Mm-hmm.
If American expansion is necessarily evil, then it doesn't matter what the benefits or drawbacks would be for particular people in particular places. Now, there are some people who say it's unrealistic, and it might well be unrealistic, but if it's unrealistic, then why is it unrealistic? I don't see people offering data-driven arguments about what people in Greenland think or what the economics of it would be. I'm not seeing that. And what that suggests to me is that most people are having an ideological reaction to the question. And perhaps part of the political motivation in talking about it is to provoke an ideological reaction and to get that put on display.
Oh, and without having any real knowledge of what's going on, I just presume that Trump is gaming the algorithm. This is just a way of getting some attention. And I think that's a somewhat popular. I mean, it's a popular, or it's not like a novel idea. It's kind of an obvious idea. Trump says all kinds of outrageous things all the time. But I guess I'm just curious if you know of anybody who thinks that he's serious, and if he is serious, what are the consequences, or these kinds of questions that you're asking? How are you? I mean, you're saying nobody else is kind of asking these questions. Well, it would then seem like you are. So I'm curious what you make of this. Would it be good for Greenland? That kind of thing.
Yeah, there are some different levels of seriousness that you can take on this. One would be to frame it as a political tactic to provoke an anti-American response from certain people for the purposes of showing that those people have anti-American intuitions or instincts, right? That would be
Mm-hmm.
a relatively unserious level, but it would still have a political function, right? A level up from that would be, is this part of negotiating with the Europeans about NATO or about NATO armaments? Is this maybe saying if the United States were to leave NATO, then it might want to be secure against the Europeans in some sense? If it's not allied with them, then it would need to be secured against them. And then say the territory of Greenland would be potentially quite relevant, because this would be, if, say, the Europeans were not part of an American alliance structure, a potential launch pad for various forms of potentially anti-American behavior. So if you think back to before this alliance system was set up, back in the day, there was this concern about a European presence in North America as potentially posing a security threat to the United States. So one way of kind of posturing about NATO would be to say, hey, if you guys want us out of NATO, or if you're not prepared to commit the resources that are necessary to keep us in NATO, then we not only would not defend you, but we would become concerned about territories that you possess in our hemisphere. And that would extend not just to Greenland, but also potentially to Canada. And this would be an attempt to revive the kind of Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt corollary discourse from way back when, which asserts that Europeans are not permitted in the hemisphere except on terms that we agreed to. And the Roosevelt corollary includes the proviso that the United States can eject Europeans from the hemisphere if it feels that that's necessary. The Monroe Doctrine states that the Europeans are not permitted to expand their territorial holdings in the hemisphere. Then the Roosevelt corollary asserts the right to expel them.
So these are...
So it could be an attempt to return to that, or to express the possibility of a return to that as a way of negotiating with the Europeans when it comes to their NATO payments.
So this was a sort of policy slash diplomacy relation set of decisions between a couple of presidents that was pretty anti-European, and it was in effect for some time, and now it's not, and we might go back to it. That's kind of what I'm taking from what you said.
Well, way back when the United States first became independent, the large international relations threats to the United States were framed as coming from the European states, which might want to subjugate the United States, principally Britain, of course, but not just Britain. Other European states might look at the 13 colonies as a weak, fragile state that could be absorbed or subjugated by them, France, Spain, etc. Right. And indeed, the War of 1812 was framed in the United States as an attempt by Britain to reclaim the United States. And during the Civil War, the British supported the Confederates materially in various ways. They entertained the possibility of sending military forces to help the Confederates. And so there were also severe concerns about Canada being potentially used as a launch pad for opening up a second front vis-a-vis the Confederates. Even as late as the First World War, Germany attempted to use Mexico to open up a second front against the United States to prevent the Americans from sending so many troops to Western Europe. So this was something that before the United States became the superpower was a continuing source of distress for the American foreign policy experts. They were continuously concerned about these foreign states potentially using territorial launch pads to intervene in the hemisphere. And you might even think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis as an instance of this, in which the Soviet Union looked to station weapons, particularly nuclear weapons, in Cuba to give the Soviets access to targets that might otherwise be difficult to hit for them technologically from the territory of the Russian Federation. And this was something which almost resulted in nuclear war, or at least we were given the impression that it almost resulted in nuclear war in the early 60s. So there has been longstanding concern by the United States about foreign states getting involved in the Western Hemisphere. And initially, the United States was too weak to eject states from the Western Hemisphere. But following on from McKinley and Roosevelt, the United States reached a point at which it could potentially expel states. And indeed, the Spanish-American War was an instance of the United States expelling a European power from adjacent territory in the Western Hemisphere. In that case, Cuba, Puerto Rico, which the United States picked up by expelling the Spanish from the hemisphere. Now, that wasn't extended to the Canadians or to Greenland. But we have seen the United States on many occasions use its influence to try to reduce the presence of the Europeans, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but also in other parts of the world. The United States frequently in other parts of the world supported decolonization efforts. Now, not exclusively. There were occasions where the United States backed the Europeans in spots where they believed that the resistance movement was communist in character, say the support of the French Empire in Vietnam. But on many, many occasions, there was a push by the United States to get the Europeans to relinquish control in various places in various countries. And the United States was, for that reason, often looked at as a potential helper state by independence movements in different parts of the world. Now, once the Europeans became allies of the United States after World War II, the relationship became more complicated. The Europeans often offered themselves up to the Americans as helpers in peacekeeping. They would say, don't you want us involved in this area because we can help you more cheaply secure order in it? We have people who have been involved in this part of the world for a long time. We have regional expertise in this particular place. Don't you want us involved? We'd like to help you. And so, through the alliance structure, through Atlanticism, the United States was often leveraging European expertise in different places. And the Europeans, in this way, stayed relevant past the point at which they had the raw military capability to be relevant in many of these places. But this is something where if we start talking about changing the relationship, if Europeans start talking about trying to go their own way in foreign policy because they don't like the new administration, or if the new administration is interested in a pivot to Asia and in drawing down the American presence in Europe, or if the new administration is just interested in making Europeans spend more money on defense, which is the kind of minimum threshold position it would need to have, then one of the ways in which the administration can negotiate is by reminding the Europeans of how the world would be different in various ways without NATO.
Mm.
And one of the ways it would be different is that the United States would regard the Europeans not as allied states, but as potentially hostile foreign states, where their presence in the hemisphere is potentially an issue. And relative to that, it would be much less expensive for the Europeans to increase their defense spending marginally. That might be the way that the administration's thinking. There might also be certain long-range visions with respect to Greenland, to do with the opening of the Northwest Passage, to do with mineral wealth that is likely to be unlocked in Greenland as glaciers recede. And if you have the view that climate change is going to happen and that this is something that you need to adapt to, then getting control of territory, which is currently under ice sheets and is therefore currently undervalued, could be important. And Iceland, by the way, is a state which also used to be controlled by the Scandinavian states, but which was granted independence following on from World War II and became an independent republic. This was something that was done in part with the encouragement of the United States.
Yes, somebody in the live chat was saying that we should compare to Iceland. So maybe we could elaborate just a little on that before we bring on a special guest in a couple of minutes here, folks. We have a surprise visitor to the podcast. But before we get to that, just really quick, what's the Iceland comparison? Can we just dwell with that for a moment?
So in the case of Iceland, the United States supported the creation of an independent republic there, rather than seeking to take the territory and make it either a U.S. territory or a U.S. state.
Okay.
Now, I think one of the things that is interesting is that oftentimes when the United States increases its influence, it does this not by taking territory or by adding states, but by creating puppet governments. And oftentimes you'll see people argue that this is better because it allows the state to retain autonomy. But I think in many cases, it's arguably worse because it means that if that state gets into trouble, it doesn't have the resources of the United States to potentially draw in a crisis. And we've seen some of these states, they become independent, and then because they're independent, there's a question about their security, or there's a question about their economic position. And when they have an economic crisis or when they have a security crisis, they may not be confident that they'll get US support, economic and military support. And they may have to go to the IMF hat in hand and beg for money. And when they go to the IMF, what are they going to? They're going to the Western states that are predominantly the creditor states. And those states then force them to adopt various policies against the will often of their democratic publics. And that is their only way of getting access to the money. If you're part of the United States, the European Union, other large blocs, then there are certain rules you can potentially appeal to for getting economic help in a time of crisis or for getting security help in a time of crisis that you wouldn't be able to get if you're an independent state. And oftentimes, it's better to be in the territory than not in the territory. Puerto Rico is disadvantaged relative to a US state, but it is significantly advantaged relative to independent island states in the Caribbean, which have much less access to Western aid in the event of a problem. This is a similar point was recently made by the president of France, Macron, who, when he visited a French territory in the Indian Ocean, pointed out, you are much better off than islands that are not part of French territory because they don't get any French help. They have to go through international institutions, and those institutions are much less forgiving than that state. Now, it's still, I think, the case that Puerto Rico is treated unjustly relative to, say, Hawaii or relative to Rhode Island. And so there are levels and levels in terms of how integrated you can be. But it's not at all obvious that it's bad for a state to become a US state that's currently not one. And the fact that we never talk about whether it would be better for a particular territory to become a US state than not one, that we never discuss it, and no one is even prepared to argue about it, I think suggests thought taboos about that question. Ideological blinders that are up that prevent us from thinking about that. That's not to say that any particular answer would be reached one way or the other. And I think in different cases in different parts of the world, you might arrive at different answers for different reasons. But people don't even ask the question, and they're not prepared to argue about it, except in terms of anti-imperialism, Uncle Sam man bad.
Right.
And that's not a good argument. Let's bring Chris on. I want to ask him about this piece.
That's right, everybody. Well, spoiler alert. Yeah, we've got somebody here. Folks, longtime friend of the channel, Chris Cutrone. Welcome, Chris. How you doing today?
Good. How's it going, Dave? Hi, Ben.
Fantastic. Hey. So you're a perfect example of somebody who is breaking the thought taboo, I think, with this recent article that you published to Compact. Maybe you could share with everybody a little bit about that.
All right. Well, I was invited, just a few days ago to write the article by Jeff Schellenberger, the editor at Compact. He wrote me and solicited an article, and I just so happened to have a night off from teaching. I thought that I had to teach my social workers, but I had the night off, and I just thought, okay, I'm just going to bang this out. I know what I think about it. Sent it in later that night, and then they turned it around in a day and published it the next day.
How's that going?
It was, it's which was good. I mean, they edited it. I'll say a couple of things. So they took out a reference to the Monroe Doctrine, where I just pointed out that the Monroe Doctrine was meant to secure the freedom of the Western Hemisphere. It was not initially about imperialism. So the 20th century invocation of the Monroe Doctrine has to be distinguished from its original intention. So the difference between a kind of Jeffersonian view expressed by Monroe and Madison, an American revolutionary view from a kind of capitalist and especially Cold War view in the 20th century. They took that out, and they also took out, they always tend to shave off my puckishness. They took out a reference to the X-Files, which I thought, how could you invoke this image as I did of Camp Century, this nuclear base under the ice, and not think about the X-Files, especially when Trump, Make America Great Again, it either refers to the 50s, the 80s, or the 90s. And the 90s are the X-Files. And, I'm sure that there are conspiracy theorists out there, maybe even Tucker Carlson, who thinks that actually Trump wants Greenland because there's a UFO buried under the ice, that the US is hiding evidence behind the mask of Danish sovereignty of UFOs in Greenland. So don't discount that possibility.
I would never. I mean...
I don't think the bullet that killed JFK is buried in the ice in Greenland, but UFOs might be.
Yeah, they could be. I mean, all kinds of stuff could be, I suppose.
Right. So they took out the twinkle in the eye that I'd like to put in my writing. I don't know. I think that they have their own anxieties compact.
Oh, I
They
think
have
they
their own
do.
thoughts.
I think
Yeah.
they do. Yeah,
Right.
100%.
So, but maybe to get at Ben, what you raised, was I just trying to provoke the anti-imperialist left and show just how, frightened and unthinking they are? That wasn't really my intention. Believe it or not, I don't write clickbait. Now they gave it a different title, also a compact. They gave it a much more positive kind of cheerleading title. My original title was "Why Not Greenland?" In other words, to echo my "Why Not Trump?" Because really, that's the issue. The issue is, what's the argument against this? Are there any good arguments against the U.S. annexing Greenland? Obviously, if the people of Greenland don't want it, that would be an argument against it, but that's not entirely clear. And indeed, Greenland declaring independence, which does seem to have been recently motivated by Trump's proposal, would probably put Greenland more in the American sphere than the European sphere, even more than it is now. So on anti-imperialism, it's this tricky thing. In all the Twitter discourse and the Facebook discourse, that has blown up around my article, what's come up is like multipolarity, which is, am I turning multipolarity against people, right? In terms of, well, what do they want, right? And it's an important point because, Ben, you raised Puerto Rico. I think Puerto Rico should be a state. It should long ago have been a state. And probably the Pacific territories of the United States should also be states. They should have full constitutional status in terms of the residents there. But Greenland, it has the population of about 1/10 of a US congressional district. Very different from Iceland. Iceland has 500,000 people, I think. So it has the population of like Boston. So Greenland, has a low population, and the majority are Inuit, and they actually came after the Scandinavians, interestingly enough. Now, I also will say that I took the opportunity of Greenland because Trump also opened up this rhetoric of, settling scores with Canada.
Right.
Because I think,
I only heard in passing that he also said something about Canada. So now that we're bringing that in, could you just elaborate on that a little bit to say what he said?
Oh, well, he talked with Justin Trudeau. All sorts of people have been visiting him at Mar-a-Lago. And, and he referred to Justin Trudeau as the governor of the 51st state. Right. And he also has famously raised the War of 1812 with Trudeau. I don't know if he did it this time, but I think he had done it in the past when he was president, reminding them, of the War of 1812 and the continuing beef that the US might have with Canada. And I just pointed out, look, the only reason why Canada exists is because it was a territorial limit of the Revolution. Like, certainly the American Revolution should have included Canada.
Right.
And that was demonstrated not only in the War of 1812, but the Civil War. I was just watching recently, there's an Apple Plus TV series, Manhunt, which is about the Secretary of War, Stanton, leading the pursuit of John Wilkes Booth after the assassination of Lincoln, and finding the international conspiracy behind the assassination of Lincoln, which was run out of Montreal. So Canada is a counter-revolutionary bulwark. It only exists because of counter-revolution. What is Canada? Canada is the counter-revolution. What is America? America is the revolution. And thankfully, they highlighted one of my key statements, that America is revolutionary or it's nothing. Mm-hmm. So finally, on the Canada point, I would just say that the left in my generation, and I think subsequently as well with millennials, always makes an invidious comparison between the United States and Europe and Canada. So Europe and Canada are model social democratic welfare states as opposed to the neoliberal free market backward American capitalism. And I would just point out that, of course, Trump, what he said to Trudeau is, aren't you guys living off the largesse of the United States and Canada? And of course, that's true, meaning the Canadian welfare state is based on American capitalism. That's the truth. So is European welfarism. That's also was based, coming out of World War II, on the vitality of American capitalism. So the US remains the dynamo of global capitalism. China depends on American capitalist recovery for its own well-being. That's simply true. So what are we even talking about if we're going to, be as anti-American? Like, the left in the United States is more anti-American than China is, than the Chinese Communist Party is. The American left is more anti-American than Vladimir Putin is.
No, I mean,
And
the
that's
American left is just like this sad, dumb version of the new left, which became just anti-America at some point. I mean, that's...
Yeah, they didn't start out that way. They started out wanting to revitalize the American revolutionary tradition. There's a long left tradition in the United States of claiming for socialism the legacy of the American Revolution. It goes back to Eugene Debs. He said, look, Jefferson, Washington, Lincoln, they belong to us socialists. They don't belong to the Democrats and Republicans. So that used to just be very common. And of course, the civil rights movement called themselves the New Abolitionists. And a lot of what motivated the reforms of the 60s was the centenary of the Civil War, the centenary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the centenary of the Reconstruction post-Civil War amendments. And so the idea was, a century later, we're going to finish this task of the last major push of the American Revolution, which was the Civil War. Now, I'll point out the European left, this is, going to sound very tendentious, but it's not. So Tariq Ali, who was a very big 60s new leftist, British, Pakistani British new leftist, editor for a long time of Verso books, so associated with the New Left Review. He has said very clearly that the world should regret the victory of the Union in the Civil War, because if the Confederacy had won, it would have stopped the growth of US imperialism.
Who said that again?
So,
sorry, who said that?
Tariq Ali.
Tariq,
he's a major figure.
He's the Verso guy.
Tariq Verso, is the... yeah. So he's the one. He's the one. Is my generation.
Is this why?
Maybe not for you guys.
He's the one who blacklisted everybody, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've met him. He knows me. I've interviewed him. I mean, it's I guess he's a blacklister. Not as bad as Sebastian Budgen.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah,
all
yeah.
right.
No,
I get my people mixed up.
No, he's a little bit above the fray, Tariq Ali. I think
cool.
What's interesting is that in his semi-retirement, Tariq Ali has bought the home in the Black Sea that Trotsky lived in his first exile out of the Soviet Union. It's like a kind of scenic, island mansion in Turkey.
So I want to ask Chris a question about the peas.
Weird flex.
I want to ask Chris a question real quick, Dave.
Yeah.
So the bit that stood out to me about it that I thought was interesting is the line that the future belongs to America. And I think that this thought, I don't know if that was your line.
It's taken out of, it's sort of a condensation of something that I formulated in the article, but it's their title and it's their like pithy formulation of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Insofar as you might agree with that line, I think it expresses something that might be very fundamental to a particular kind of socialist position, which would be that if socialism has to happen in the advanced capitalist states,
right,
and if the core of the capitalist world is the United States, then socialism has to happen in the United States first, or at least very quickly it has
Yeah,
to
I
come to
was
the
gonna
United
say.
States after it happens somewhere else, right? And
Hmm.
then the larger American territory is, the easier it would be for it to spread in the world by taking root in the United States.
Yeah, so that's right. I mean, I think that this is seen by people who are very critical of me. For instance, Conrad Hamilton, who's associated with sublation, has called my perspective Yankee Doodle ultra leftism. And as some kind of like socialist patriotism, and and it's not that, because obviously I do think of capitalism as contradictory, meaning the United States is a very contradictory thing, and we do have to deal with it, meaning it has these two souls, we might say. It has a bourgeois revolutionary soul, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, inalienable rights for all equally, which the Confederates said no, they were wrong about that. And it has the capitalist soul that contradicts it. And really the issue is decline of the United States. And again, this is where I feel like someone of my generation just has to be here to remind people that the decline of the US has been declared ever since the 60s, and it hasn't really happened yet. And we shouldn't expect it to happen, and we shouldn't certainly bank on it happening, and we shouldn't just be sitting and waiting for it to happen. Right?
Is
In
it
other words,
something we should wish to see?
right. Is it something that we should wish to see? I mean, it could be that the US declines and, we're not in a position to do much about it. Now, but I do think that, as opposed to the imagination of the millennial left coming out of the 2008 crisis, socialism should not be seen, as indeed it was in Western Europe after World War II, as an austerity measure that comes out of capitalist desolation, meaning that a downturn forces socialism to be adopted. That's not really a good way of thinking about the struggle for socialism. It also comes from the 1930s Great Depression era, which didn't lead to socialism, but led to fascism. So, in fact, if you look historically, the greatest increases in the socialist working class movement took place during boom periods of capitalism. So, if anything, we should wish for a boom in American capitalism and in global capitalism. We should not wish for a decline, either globally or in the United States. And again, the world depends on American economic dynamism, for better or for worse. I mean, look, for better or for worse, but we are here. Are we going to make use of the opportunity we have?
It seems to me that the major difference between you and the people who disagree with you on this issue is that they don't think that the revolution has to be American. They think that the revolution indeed not only doesn't have to be American, but can't be American. They have decided that the United States is necessarily a counter-revolutionary force.
Right.
And therefore, they think the revolution has to be somewhere else. And therefore, anything which would strengthen or expand the American state and economy, they necessarily reject. Whereas
it's a
for
Stalinist
you,
view. Yeah. It's a Stalinist Cold War view. And I just point out in my article, there's a lot of little things in my article. So I point out that, the US and China made an alliance against the Soviet Union in the 70s. And it has led to the rise of China, and it did lead in some way to the collapse of the Soviet Union. People forget that China was an active military ally in the late Cold War against the Soviet Union. They supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. They supported various US-sponsored movements, civil wars in Africa. They fought directly in league with the United States against the Soviet Union, against what they called Soviet imperialism. And they said, in these conditions of Soviet imperialism, the US is more progressive. Yeah, now you could just say that's just geopolitical, maneuvering and just, ideological rationalization, but the left forgets this history. And, again, the idea that the world benefits from the decline of the superpower, well, I mean, there's another little theme I'd throw in there, which is anti-imperialism and anti-fascism. So you might wish for the decline of the US out of anti-imperialism, but you might regret the decline of the US out of anti-fascism, because if the US were to suffer a steep decline, the result would probably be actual fascism, not what people call Trump, which obviously Trump's not a fascist. So there's a division over the threat of Trump. Is he an imperialist? Is he a fascist? And, what's the difference? And, which one are we fearing and wishing for at the same time, to bring in a little Freudian ambivalence there?
In wishing for him to fulfill these roles, he would shore up particular worldviews, much of which come out of the 20th century and out of the Cold War. And if you have a tendency, or if you as an intellectual or as a theorist depend upon the continuing seeming viability of those 20th century perspectives, then you'll want to frame the United States and what the United States is doing in a way such that it fits within that framework.
Yes. And I just think we shouldn't be doing that. We should really be open to what's happening. I mean, the basic point is, there's some significant likelihood that the US will acquire Greenland.
You really think so?
What about that? Yeah, of course. This is in motion. I mean, it's 57,000 people, and it's the United States, and it's Denmark. They can strike a deal, of course. There
are some potential reasons to do it.
Can we clarify?
There are some reasons to do it.
Can we clarify what is in motion? Because all I heard is that Trump
has made an initiative. The U.S. presidency is a powerful position.
What do you mean by he's made an initiative? Because there's one thing is to say it.
There's an attempt to negotiate.
Yeah,
there is.
In some way, it's being used as a negotiating chip. How seriously is it being used is not clear, but it is being used.
He sent his son there. He sent Trump Force One there. That's the picture for the Compact article. This is serious. He did raise it seriously in the first administration, and he's bringing it up now. One reason why Trump might want it, there are reasons why he can get U.S. capitalism behind the initiative. But he wants to go down in history as an important American president. And adding U.S. territory is like an undeniable accomplishment. It's like a permanent monument to Trump's presidency, even if it is a barren wasteland with less than 1/10 of a U.S. congressional district's population. To him, it means something. He's going to try to get this done. He is. Now, and it could happen. That's all that I'm saying. And what are we to make of that? In other words, are the left just like cowering in fear at anything that happens, at any change that takes place? What kind of an attitude is that? Reality is moving on.
Yeah, it seems to be kind of like a left problem.
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious, since you've employed the royal we here a few times, I'll go ahead and say I don't take any personal responsibility, nor do I have any aspirations to belong to or guide the American left. But I'm fascinated by the project.
Did I say we about the United States? I usually don't make that mistake.
Oh no, about the left. It was about the left, socialism. Yeah.
The left. I mean, look, I'm dealing with leftists, and so you, Dave, might counter-identify a little bit, but I still identify as a leftist.
For sure.
I don't want to cut myself off from everyone on the basis of that identification. Now, and so,
except that Cutrone, they would probably, if you didn't want to cut yourself off from people, you'd probably do better actually just being like, identify as something that, I don't know. I feel like,
No, Dave. I'm a teacher.
You're trying
Socrates.
The American left is anti-American. I don't.
Right.
You want to change that?
It should at least haunt their dreams. In other words, they should wake up in a cold sweat and be like, "Fuck Cutrone, Greenland. Fuck, what the fuck?" Right?
Yeah.
Like, in other words, and I know that does happen. So I just have to lean into it. Meaning, I didn't write a clickbait article. I knew it would be provocative to a certain extent. I thought about it being in compact, and I thought, okay, these compact people are going to want Greenland, and how can I say, well, you don't want it the way I want it. I want it for socialism. You want it for American like whatever American capitalism, but they're anti-capitalist, you know, like what is that? Like why is compact? You know, because it came out of nowhere. It talk about coming out of nowhere. I did not expect to be solicited by Compact to write a Greenland article. I did not. Not at all. It totally surprised me, and I was like, oh, okay. And then, like, what does it mean for me to write this article in Compact? I have to live up to expectations, you know, but also try to influence them, because they do promote my articles very enthusiastically, and I feel like that also affects them. Stand behind my article, Compact. What does that do to them?
So, Chris, I want to ask you about the Atlantic piece that mentioned you and what you think about that. But
Jonathan
before I
Chase.
do that,
Yeah.
before I do that, I want to play a quick little game with you called Should It Be a State, to give people a little bit of sense of exactly how far this goes. So
Yes.
I'll ask you a country, and you say whether you think it should be a U.S. state. Canada,
Yes.
the United Kingdom,
Maybe. Airstrip 1. Oceania. Japan, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK, just so that Orwell is fulfilled. However, contrarily to his perspective. I don't know if Japan was part of Oceania. Maybe not. Maybe it was part of East Asia, as opposed to Eurasia. But, you know, the Anzac, you know, the Five Eyes. Yeah, the Five Eyes should be states.
the AUKUS states.
Yeah. Yeah, the AUKUS states. Now, look, you know, you brought up Puerto Rico, the Philippines.
Should the Philippines be a state?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
South Korea?
I don't know. I mean, there is a question of like history. And so I do think that the US owes the Philippines, right? And so I don't think that Philippine independence has been great. Right. And so, you know, the thing with decolonization, okay, let's talk about that for a second. You know, because the US didn't really have many colonies, and probably the clearest example of a colony was the Philippines. Much more clearly than Puerto Rico in some ways. You know, they have a divergent kind of history, and the US fought a counterinsurgency in the Philippines. It didn't fight such a counterinsurgency in Puerto Rico. So, you know, the US did harm, and they do owe the Philippines, right? So there's that kind of history. You know, I was thinking about this, you know, United States of the world, you know, or the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Was it meant to expand to be the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics of the world? Yeah, it did, in fact, mean to be that. Absolutely. So there's that issue. But in terms of like capitalism, and the way the US absorbs a great deal of labor from the Philippines still, you know, so I mean, I used to joke when George W. Bush invaded Iraq, you know, because this is the formative experience of the millennials. You know, if you break it, you own it. You know, I said, you know, these neocons, you know, if they really want to do this, then they should make Iraq a state, and they should move the capital of the US to Baghdad. You know, how much do they really want to liberate the world? Now, the other joke that I made in some of my social media banter around my article was Israel-Palestine should be a state.
I mean, at this point, fuck. At this point, fuck.
That would
I mean,
solve
that's an easy
Talk
solution.
about you. Talk about you broke it, you own it. Don't you think? Because obviously, if they were a state or US territory, then the abuse of the Palestinians would at least take a different form.
Yeah.
Right. You know, like, look, I'm not going to say, if you say that Puerto Rico is abused by the United States, I'm not going to dispute that. But so is Mississippi. So is West Virginia. Rampant capitalist exploitation, obviously. I mean, obviously the United States is a highly differentiated, variegated polity.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
And
standard of
so,
living in Mississippi or West Virginia is considerably lower. Human Development Index considerably lower than the median
yeah,
state.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
I just think, again, it's really a political question. It's a political question, and I know that I want to get people to question their reflexive nationalism.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a kind
Or
of the
anti.
anti-Americanism. Well, nationalism in the sense of assuming the natural character of the nation state rather than the political character of the nation state.
Yeah, because this is not a nationalist American. It's not American nationalism. The view is that it doesn't matter. These essential distinctions that people claim are the basis for why different populations can't be integrated into the United States. Chris's claim is that that is bullshit, that it is actually the case that people in different parts of the world could become Americans, even if they have all sorts of different cultural practices, language differences, religious differences.
I used to like to say that from the founding fathers' perspective, maybe you guys know this one. It's the proverbial Jefferson's Quran. The founding fathers contemplated the US being a Muslim country eventually. Right? The question was like, is there a religion that goes with the values of the American Revolution? And they contemplated this. And they were like, well, Christianity kind of does, Protestantism kind of does, but maybe Islam does more comport well with the values of the American Revolution. They thought about this. So I always like to joke that if the US were Muslim and spoke Chinese and still had the Constitution, it would still be the US. Because it would.
Yeah, and I think that's an important claim. I think that oftentimes these arguments for expansion that come from Chris's point of view are misrecognized as nationalism when they are actually a sharp critique and repudiation of nationalist explanations, which are typically given for why the United States can't or mustn't expand, because this would, it's argued, in various ways transgress against the rights of nations or peoples or societies which are ostensibly distinct from in fundamental permanent ways.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
This
question I want to get to about the Atlantic.
Oh yeah, the Atlantic article. Right.
Yeah, because you were in Compact, this raised your profile to the point at which you could be part of the list of people who have done the bad thing in the Atlantic. And I wanted to ask you how you felt about getting into the Atlantic.
So I'm sitting there watching TV last night, and I'm on my laptop, and I open a new browser window, and it's MSN because I have a Windows machine, and it immediately feeds you articles. And the article that pops up is the intellectual rationalization for taking Greenland. And I click on it just because I'm curious as to what is said. And then I'm like reading it, and I'm like, before I even get to my name, I'm like, are they going to talk about my article? And of course they did. And I just had to laugh out loud. And I kind of screamed to my husband Fazal. I was like, holy shit, they are polemicizing against me in the Democratic Party House Journal. I mean, there are two House journals of the Democratic Party, the Atlantic and the New Republic. And the Atlantic, much more kind of stalwart. The New Republic sometimes has posed as a kind of right-wing kind of criticism of the Democratic Party. So they've been associated with like kind of a neoliberal, a kind of conservative critique of the Democrats. But the Atlantic are pretty much just the center of the Democratic Party. Like that's what you get articulated. Ta-Nehisi Coates is, famously he laid out his whole argument as a columnist in the Atlantic. So the Atlantic is like the thing, right? And then I was like, okay, Jonathan Chait. I mean, I kind of know who it is, but I also kind of don't know who it is. And then the Compact editors wrote me an email to say he supported the Iraq War. And I was like, oh, wow. What a strange phenomenon now that he's gonna, that he's an Iraq war supporter. Because I had just watched an interview with David Frum, and David Frum had also published an article in the Atlantic about like America's lonely future or marauding America. That was another title of the article, where he was talking about how Trump's not an isolationist, but he's going to alienate the US from the rest of the world. So it was in keeping with, and David Frum is another, like, he was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, an advocate, and in his interview around his article, which was with Amanpour and Company for PBS, he was not particularly contrite about the Iraq War. He said, we tried to do the right thing and it didn't work out, but we had good motives. And I thought, well, okay, like I could see how he might think that, but there's no questioning, right? Like there's no and there's a total rejection of Trump because Trump is willing to say that was wrong. It wasn't just a mistake, it was wrong. And so I didn't realize Jonathan Chait fell into that same kind of category. But, ironically enough, right? So he's going to go after me as what he called a horseshoe theory Marxism, for being pro-imperialist, because his whole thing was Compact is supposedly anti-imperialist. They're Trumpists, they're anti-neocon, but here they are, saber rattling against a peaceful ally and taking issue with wars against, deadly enemies like Russia and Ukraine. Right? So it's actually a kind of weird roundabout criticism of Trump's anti-war policy by accusing me and Compact of being pro-war, like as if the annexation of Greenland is a war proposal. I brought up in the article, that Trump, said that all options are on the table, economic and military, only to point out that he then said, no military option for Canada, even though by historical right, maybe there should be a military option for Canada, but not for Panama and Greenland, right? But he said Panama and Greenland, and again, I'm old enough, I remember George Herbert Walker Bush invading Panama to arrest Noriega on drug smuggling charges. That was a major intervention that took place when I was a young person. It's kind of a formative experience for me when I was first on the left. So but then this gets turned into, Cutrone and Compact are saber rattling against a peaceful ally against Denmark and Greenland. So it's very strange, but I think it's a dishonest argument. I mean, I guess that's the point. I'm not one to really lean on that, but it does seem like the Jonathan Chait argument is a dishonest one, and it's meant to,
much of what was wrong about their position was not liberalism, but nationalism. It was the view that Iraq had to be a nation, and if it wasn't a nation, then it had to be nation built. It had to be turned into one if it wasn't one.
Right.
There couldn't be a solution which understood that it doesn't need to be a nation state. No,
that was Biden, by the way.
Yeah.
Biden, if you recall, he said maybe Iraq shouldn't be. Maybe it should go back to its old Ottoman provinces. Right.
Yeah, there was some talk about that. But I think part of why no one would ever consider the possibility of should Iraq be a U.S. state is this idea that it has to be treated as an independent nation, which has just been oppressed by a dictator and therefore has a democracy which belongs to its nation and all that gobbledygook that they like to trot out. I
also remember the Gulf War. The Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein disputed the legitimacy of Kuwait. Mm-hmm. In other words, wasn't Kuwait just created by the British as like a colonial plot, to steal resources from Iraq? I mean, of course, Saddam Hussein, that's demagogy. But there's an example from my husband's home country, Malaysia, where Brunei is basically a Malay sultanate. It's a Malay kingdom, but it is separate from Malaysia because it's an oil principality, the way Kuwait is.
Yeah, and this is one of the major problems in the post-colonial world, is being stuck with the borders that the colonial masters left you with. And if you try to revise those borders, then there's some kind of intervention to stop you from doing that. And this prevents the, people in other parts of the world from dynamically creating new kinds of polities.
Exactly.
And is a major obstacle to their creativeness and their ability to politically invent. Yeah, on Jonathan Chait, I do want to point out, so that you fully capture, this is a guy everybody knows. In The Week, the magazine that I've gotten for 20 years, to follow the elite US establishment media, which is what it is a compendium of stuff from, principally, with a little bit of sprinkling in from international. But he regularly appears wherever he writes in the best columns of the week US.
Oh, wow.
With great frequency, to the point where I knew his name 20 years ago. I would have recognized that. So, yeah.
So he's a major opinionator of the elite?
Yes, he is. He is one of probably the 5 or 6 most influential people who write for them.
There you go,
well,
Chris.
At least he had to be subjected to my writing. I don't know if the computer virus made it past, the firewall, but
So why is it that there is such a popular elite position that wants to grab its pearls at the idea of the country that has boots on the ground in 150 countries actually scooping up those countries rather than sitting there and pretending to big brother them or whatever, arming them and training them or whatever? Like, what? I mean, I just come from a position of like, I'm just genuinely curious. Like, well, I don't understand what all the fuss is about. I understand, like, for some people it's because their identity is very much like based in this idea of a national liberation struggle. But outside of those people, well, I just don't.
I mean, I would generally
I
favor
don't get it.
Greenlander independence, but I think that the issue there, and I brought up the Philippines before, so there's the guy Aguinaldo, who's a major kind of Filipino nationalist. And his historical legacy is somewhat tarnished because he ended up collaborating with the Japanese. But in the 1930s, he made a statement that I always like to recall, which is that there was no question of Philippine independence. There was only a question of being dependent on the US or on Japan. Right. So on the one hand,
Right.
I, of course, favor the self-determination of the Inuit people who live in Greenland. On the other hand, what does that amount to in a capitalist world? I think that one of the ways that capitalist politics right now is being falsely polarized is so-called globalism versus nationalist populism. And so neoliberalism is associated with globalism, and nationalist populism is seen as the alternative. My old professor, Moish Postone, said, it could be that capitalism just oscillates between free market and statist forms. And by that, he meant nationalist versus internationalist forms. And I said to him at the time, I said, well, that would be deeply unfortunate. And yet it does seem to be bearing out to a certain extent. Now, ideologically, I actually don't think that Trump is a nationalist in that way. I think he's a post-neoliberal, not an anti-neoliberal. And I think that's what's confusing about Trump. Meaning, it's not a question of, like the way the Democrats will put it, the international system and multilateral agreements that the US helps orchestrate versus a kind of nationalism. Because the attitude there is that American nationalism will just encourage the nationalism of others, and that will be bad for the world. And I don't think that we should accept that kind of polemical characterization of their opponent, namely Trump. I don't think that, we should just believe what the Democrats say and say, yeah, that's right, we're nationalists. It's like a Tucker Carlson, basically just inverted the Hillary Clinton criticism of Trump. I don't think that the capitalism is simply globalist or nationalist. I don't think it can be. I think it's always a mixture of these things. And I also think the US plays a unique role in the world, meaning that because it is the central capitalist country, it can't be nationalist the way other countries are. It has to be, in a sense, balancing the needs of global capitalism versus the needs of domestic capitalism for its own interests, in fact. Right. So The whole language of is it true that the ruling class has sold out the US to foreign competitors, sold out the US working class through globalization? I don't think that that's really an accurate depiction of things. I don't support that view. At the same time, we are living in a period, especially post global recession and post COVID, where by necessity, there's been a certain amount of nationalist retrenchment among various countries. Or at least, I think the way that I put it in Why Not Trump into 2016, at least there's going to be some reconfiguration of global trade, and that's going to be demagogued in these terms.
Is that what you mean by post-neoliberal, a reconfiguration of trade? So does that mean that the organizations that we would typically associate with neoliberalism, e.g. the WTO, those are no longer going to be the organizations which play the primary role in deciding how trade occurs?
That's possible, that the institutions themselves will be abandoned and be replaced. Another more likely outcome is that their policies will be changed. In other words, that the role that they play will be reformed, meaning they won't play exactly the same role and they won't do the exact same policies as before. They won't serve quite the same function.
So to help me analytically to get clear on this, what are the things that would need to change in terms of how, say, the WTO operates for us to say now the WTO is post-neoliberal as opposed to neoliberal? What would be the specific things? Because this is something I always have a hard time with, people talking about the end of neoliberalism, all the way back to that Colin Crouch book. And then the what does it mean becomes so difficult. I have a very hard time with this.
I'll use an example, which is the Greek crisis, the Greek sovereign debt crisis, and how Obama and Francois Hollande, who was the socialist president of France at the time, as well as, I think, the head of the IMF, if I'm not mistaken, I'm trying to remember who that was at the time, they were actually quite opposed to and critical of the German position with respect to Greek debt. And so you would associate the IMF and the WTO as these kind of like cracking the whip kind of organizations that enforce economic discipline. But no, it doesn't always work that way. Right. So again, we have to step outside the usual polemical and demagogical framework for thinking about how these institutions operate. So indeed, you would normally think, okay, the IMF and the WTO are there to favor the rich countries at the expense of the poor countries, to favor the interests of the rich countries, and that the Washington Consensus represents that, but not consistently in the way that we might expect. And that can't also be simply chalked up to, well, the US is trying to dominate Europe as opposed to Germany, that it's some kind of rivalry between the US and Germany. No, there was a political difference, namely Hollande and Obama politically opposed Merkel. They had a policy difference.
Yeah, I understand that. A lot of the IMF working papers from that period were pro-stimulus or Keynesian, much more so than the German nation-state position. That makes sense to me. Was it
Christine Lagarde? Like, what is her name? Was she the head of IMF at that time?
At the time, there was that guy. There were several people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
Yeah, so,
Christine
but I recall,
Lagarde, who's the current president of the ECB.
Right. I think that she might have been IMF before that. But so we think of the
after Dominique Strauss-Kahn. Yeah.
Right. So again, when we think of capitalism and the problem of capitalism, I think that the left has a very simple rubric by which they analyze these things, which is a very like neoliberal, like kind of austerity, prioritizing profitability in some uniform way, just sort of shafting poor people, in favor of rich people. So the way it's usually thought about is before neoliberalism, there was more economic disparity between countries, but less economic disparity within countries. Whereas in neoliberalism, there's greater economic disparity within countries and less economic disparity between countries. So that's one way that it's been characterized. Again, I think that this might distort things, right? Because again, the idea is that globalism has meant greater economic inequality and greater impoverishment of the United States in order to build up the third world or something. And that this has been the collusion of elites, and I think, no, there was growth. In other words, there was going to be growth in the developing world, and that growth was going to be contradictory. Marxists used to call it combined and uneven development. What it really is contradictory development. And it involved, exploitation of the third world, but also increased exploitation of the first world. Also, the differences between the United States and Western Europe that we normally have in mind actually haven't been the case for a while, meaning there's much greater poverty in Europe and precarious work than we normally think. And so, again, the idea that like Canada and Europe represent the future, are progressive, and the US is like lagging behind, and what we want is for the US to have what they have in Europe and Canada. Well, it's not what it used to be anymore, even in those countries.
Yeah, this is something that is poorly understood. Post 2008 and then again post COVID, Europe recovered much more slowly and less completely than the United States, very much increasing the gap that existed, say, in 2007 in the Blair era, in the Bush era. And one of the things I've noticed in Europe is that Japan used to be framed as the country they don't want to be.
Right.
And now Japan is framed as the country they'd like to be because they think Japan has dealt with stagnation better than they have done.
Yeah, they want a soft landing. Exactly. They don't want to go off a cliff. Right. No, exactly. No, Japan, exactly. I mean, the other point that I'd make as regards, because actually something that you brought up maybe with Doug Lane, Ben, which is the brain drain problem, right? Immigration and the brain drain. And what I'd say about that is, there's the H-1B visa brain drain idea, but then there's also the gutting of the middle class throughout the world. In other words, if we think of the third world as being very much like the first world, except more so, meaning if post 2008, there's been a gutting of the American middle class, because there has been, well, in the third world, it's even been more drastic than that. And in those countries where you've seen an expansion of the middle class, like China and India, it actually creates a crisis. Meaning they might want to export those middle class people because they might be a political liability. The expansion of the middle class in China and India might be a political threat to the ruling parties there. So there are advantages to exporting the middle class to Europe and the United States politically. Like, again, I always like to come back to politically. What does this look like? Because ultimately, economics does shape politics, but politics does shape economics as well. Political decisions are made for political reasons under certain economic conditions, but economic interests will be sacrificed for political reasons. That does happen.
Right? Yeah, that's a fair point. And for those who are defenders of the Chinese state or the Indian governing party, they might therefore want the brain drain if they think about it, because they might want some of those people who would otherwise criticize. And indeed, a lot of, even if you go back to the Maoist critiques of the urban professionals as a potential threat to the party state. These are things that
they're going to be American fifth columns. In other words, the middle class in the third world has, in the period of neoliberalism, also been stigmatized by authoritarian regimes as some kind of fifth column for the West.
And nobody forces somebody in India to take an H-1B visa. They take it because they want to come to the United States. And they think that even with the restrictions that the H-1B will impose upon them, that they're better off in that situation than they are in India. So certainly you are talking about people who are pro-American who would be leaving because they are agreeing to accept visas that they don't have to agree to accept. It's not as if the United States conscripts people living in India or living in other parts of the world for
not
these
the way
programs.
the Gulf states actually do conscript people from Bangladesh and the Philippines to a certain extent, right? There is like quasi-slave labor that go on in some parts of the world where there are, agreements between governments. It's still voluntary. I mean, the other point that I'd make with regard to like the middle class and the hollowing out of the developing world, again, it's very uneven. There probably will be some serious capitalist development in Africa moving forward. And one of the roles that China plays is as a buffer. So Yanis Varoufakis, he calls himself an erratic Marxist economist. He points out that the rise of the Chinese currency as an international currency is not necessarily contrary to US interest, because the US might want the Chinese to absorb some of the economic volatility of the third world by putting
Yes,
their
this is a
currency.
point I've made a number of times, that there is a potential interest in getting China to lend money to states that need money, but aren't necessarily states that Western banks want to be exposed to. And
right.
that this has been something that has been explicitly raised,
Articulated. That's
in
right.
many cases by people in the banking scene, in finance in the West. Many of these states have a long history of defaulting, and yet they do need investment to grow and to become the kinds of places where you could make investments that would be more likely to be profitable, and to have another state accept the burden of
And China,
crediting.
to use an old definition of imperialism from old-fashioned Marxism from the period of the Second International, and usually associated with Lenin, but by more than him, by Kautsky and others. Chinese capital needs an outlet, meaning China has become a capital exporting country. That's the definition of an imperialist country, is that it's not a capital importing, but a capital exporting country. And that includes, by the way, exporting labor. That was part of the definition, is that, that's the way they understood late colonialism. That late colonialism is a function of the export of both capital in the form of finance capital and in the form of labor. Both actual people, but also in terms of creating new proletarianized workforces. So
yes, and this is something that's often very clearly connected, that I think people often miss, that when a state is engaged in movement of people, it's also engaged in movement of capital, and that the movement of people and movement of capital will tend to eventually move into a kind of equilibrium position. The example I always like to give is Poland, a state where initially you had a very strong and powerful brain drain, but at the same time it sucked a ton of investment and development in, and so gradually became a quite affluent country. If you were to ask, is it good for Poland to be in the European Union immediately after it happened, you might well have said, oh, look at all the brain drain that is occurring. And yet undeniably now, 20 years later, it was very
really
clearly
benefited.
quite good for Poland.
Yeah, Poland is the great success story of Eastern Europe after the Cold War. There are other examples of success as well, but Poland's the clear example of success, and they did handle
in part because Poland has all of these negative stereotypes attached to it, which are now completely debunked by statistics. And some of these other states that have done well are smaller, and people can throw out hackles. And also some of these states now have governments that people don't like, whereas in the case of Poland, the liberals came back to power, thereby disproving the narrative that they were too far gone.
In the Brexit,
if you throw up Hungary or something, it doesn't have the same function.
No, because people don't like Orban. In the Brexit crisis around immigration to the UK, there was a question of, well, is the problem the Muslim immigrants or is it the Polish immigrants? Meaning in terms of people taking low wage jobs, or people, like nannies and other kinds of, hyper exploited labor. What was the stereotypical example? Again, in the United States, when we had like controversies around immigration, it would be about the Mexican nanny that some politician had off the books, right? But in Europe, it would be a Polish girl instead of a Mexican girl.
Yeah, particularly in the UK, where you did not have, say, in Germany, there was a large number of Turkish immigrants, and in France, a large number of Algerian immigrants from the former French colonies. In the UK, Polish immigration was very much the signature issue in the late Blair years, Gordon Brown period, when I first came to the UK in the early 10s, all about Eastern Europeans. And it wasn't until the refugee crisis in the mid-10s that it shifted gears and became really a discussion about Islamic immigration.
Oh, you mean after the Arab Spring and the Syrian Civil War? Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the other thing, is that we are living, and it's not just due to climate change, but I think that for political economic reasons, in terms of global capitalism, there is going to be a migration crisis. And to chalk it up to climate change is really to dodge the issue, which is that there might be a concentration, a consolidation of capital at the expense of developing states. Right, so all these things have to be managed. For instance, infamously, under Trump and then under Biden, maybe less so under Obama, the triangle in Central America, right? So was the US going to pay off these countries in order to get their help in tamping down migration out into the United States, right? And so that was like, what are we paying these countries? You know, what are we doing? And then the left was there to say, also from my generation, well, again, if you break it, you own it. Well, look at the role that the US played in the civil wars in the 80s that destroyed these countries. And actually, that's not what destroyed these countries, in fact. Rather, again, in the Great Recession, these countries suffered a great deal. They were impacted. The third world was impacted by the Great Recession much more severely than Europe and the United States. And Europe and the United States were hit pretty hard.
And they were also affected by the recovery and the way in which the recovery operated, which came in part through creditors looking for somebody to give money to, dumping a ton of money into particular hot countries, and then all of a sudden realizing they had overcommitted to those countries and pulling out.
So I think this is going to be a problem.
During the recovery period, countries like Turkey had quite severe whiplash problems as a consequence.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
So
that's exactly right. Go ahead.
So there's a lot here, and a lot of it is almost like it's just kind of so outside of my wheelhouse that I'm just like, cool. I mean, I could see, I think I could see why a person would say that, but there's a lot of this where it's like, I feel like a lot of your guys' statements are often situated between other strong positions and your own interventions or calculated. And I'm missing some of the ramifications sometimes, right? Now, I want to potentially we dig more into this, right? But really quick, I want to say, in the remaining time here, we were going to do 2 separate episodes. I say it's a Cutrone Zone day. Like this is a special.
No. If you guys want to move on to something else.
No.
Yeah.
Actually, this is better than what we would have done for today, and we can do what we would have done anytime. Whereas this is something that we can only do now.
I don't know.
Unless we have you back all the time, which I would always be up for.
Yeah, maybe.
Go ahead, Dave.
But I guess.
But if you want to refocus.
Well, the part about the Agora, I think we want to touch on it at least briefly enough for me to say something about the tour and what we plan on doing with Platypus. And I've got some updates on that, Benjamin. You aren't even privy to because I had another meeting with Will and Nance. And so there's some really cool stuff on the back end here. But I want to point out that a lot of the people in this chat seem very animated by these ideas, and I just wanted to say to everybody who's here, it's like it's kind of crazy. Like Theory Underground does just fine without ever talking about foreign affairs, and there seems to be a lot of very real, inarguable things that we can discuss. But then once we start getting into the foreign policy stuff, I'm just like, I mean, we're so far beyond my scope. I'm just this little peasant. I kind of am here for it. I want to eat popcorn and listen to you guys. And so I want to turn it back over in a second. But I did want to highlight that you mentioned this position. I think, Benjamin, you mentioned this as Cutrone's position being some kind of like an multipolarity or something. And on that note,
anti-nationalist, specifically anti-nationalist.
Right. And I wanted to say, everybody, if you've been following the conversations we've done with Chris here over the years, and if you've been watching recent guest lineups, or if you saw what we did with Haas the last couple times he was on, well, there's good news, drum roll, on the 24th of this month, January 2025, we are having the converdiction between Chris Cutrone and Haas Aldin, which is, to be overly simplistic, basically like a Trotsky versus Stalin kind of thing, though it's a little bit more complicated than that, because most Stalinoids are not MAGA, right? So there's something interesting there. I think you both are more sympathetic to the idea of America, maybe. What do you think about that, Chris?
Oh, me and Haas? Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I actually watched, you had Haas on with Ben, and I watched it with great interest. And I thought that a lot came out there in terms of Haas's perspective that I had not heard before. You know, I do think that it sort of came to a point. And so there'll be a lot for us to discuss. I mean, you know my move, right? Which is, okay, well, because he just had a second conversation with Dugin. So he had one conversation with Dugin. He recently had a second conversation with Dugin, and he identified as a Stalinist, a Marxist, Leninist. And you know, my attitude with respect to Haas is, actually, you're not a Marxist. You'd be better off just saying you're a Heideggerian. And I think that what came out in his discussion with you guys was he thought that Stalin, sort of despite himself, unlike Lenin or Marx, recognized the peasant as the real subject, and that therefore Heidegger was the philosopher of the Soviet Union. And I think he also said postmodernism began with the Russian Revolution and is still going on. That the postmodernism is post-capitalism, and it is exemplified by the Soviet Union, but actually contrary to the older traditional perspectives of Marx and Lenin. And that's why Stalin, like, exemplified what Heidegger was talking about. And Stalin really gave voice to the true subject, which is the peasant.
Collective. The
peasant, the collective subject. Yeah. And and, you know, and I just thought, okay, so then you're not a Marxist at all, you know? And, you know, that is what I'd love people to do, is drop their pretense to Marxism. You know, they keep it for sentimental reasons because these states still claim to be Marxist, like the Soviet Union or China in some way. But they'd be much better off just saying, because when you reinterpret it as like, okay, it's Marxism, but it's not Marxism, or, you know, you really need Heidegger to understand Marxism. You know, that the real substance of Marxist materialism is actually Heideggerian.
I just think he says that.
Well then, yeah, he did.
I think he agreed with me that Marx misses something that Heidegger gets at. That's not to say that that's the real substance of Marxism, though.
Well, it's the substance of materialism.
Interesting. Okay, so real quick, is the major contradiction then you have in mind going into that he's, I mean, because that's almost more like a name choice. I don't think that's a major contradiction. That's a branding
choice. It's an ontological perspective.
There were points during that discussion where he disavowed thinkers that we would consider Western, who have some ideas that are in some ways similar to his in terms of there being a society which therefore has to have a political instantiation which reflects or represents that in some way. You know, when I raised Rousseau and when I raised Kant and Hegel, there was this idea, you know, he would acknowledge certain similarities, but nonetheless claim that there was something distinctive which occurred at this later point.
Yes, right. The 20th century, it really comes down to the 20th century. This came up already in our conversation today, Ben, that I'm really taking issue with the ideologies and the assumptions that we inherit from the 20th century. And I think that Haas is pretty clear that, and that's the sort of neo-Stalinism, that you can't disavow the 20th century because the 20th century has been this progress, has been this advance in socialism, and the Soviet Union and China. But philosophically, Heidegger.
It's something I notice is that you're quite comfortable with terms like society or people.
Yeah.
But there's a problem with nation. And I think for you, nation is a notion of people or society which has become reified, naturalized, and made no longer something which can transform.
Yeah, and limited. I mean, it's limited, meaning that, I do have the old Marxist position on this, which is that nationalism is inherently right-wing, meaning that it's inherently an attempt to kind of control capitalism in a way that's actually more destructive. Right. It's a natural kind of reaction, but it's also one that, like all political responses to capitalism, does bear this kind of reified character. And it's the powerful one, right?
Right. So, for instance, when before you said that in principle you would support the right of the people of Greenland to have independence, that isn't a pro-Greenland nationalism claim. It's different from that in a specific way. You might explain to the audience what makes that different. I think that would help.
Oh, well, because self-determination, there are levels to this. So again, maybe some Stalinist language would be like the democratic rights of a people. And I do think there are potential reifications and mystifications involved in that. But at a very basic level, I think that everyone would accept that if the people of Greenland voted to join the US, that it should happen. Now, can I just throw in a little note? So after the Civil War, there was a plan to absorb Haiti and the Dominican Republic, specifically as Black states, to help counterbalance white people being against Black people in American politics. So, and they voted in Haiti and the Dominican Republic to join the US, but it was stopped in the US Congress from happening. So the Grant administration and Seward, Secretary of State, were trying to orchestrate the absorption of the Dominican Republic and Haiti as states in the United States, but they were stopped by basically Southern whites who did not, and Northern whites who didn't want Black states admitted to the Union. Now, would that have been imperialism? No, because the people, and of course, you can imagine the votes in Haiti and the Dominican Republic were probably affected by the interests of the rich people there, et cetera, right? So again, talking about like in the same way that a referendum in Greenland, I'm sure, would be propagandized and affected by the interested parties, both internal and external. But at some basic level, right, we would take that as some indication of the exercise of a democratic right.
Right. This reminds me of the old story about Newfoundland. When Newfoundland was in a financial crisis and they were voting on whether to join Canada, which many of them did not want to do because the Newfoundlander population was disproportionately Irish Catholic. This question of could they instead seek independence and then try, after having done that, to become part of the United States. And the reason ultimately they voted to join Canada is that they could not get assurances from the United States that if they did that, that they could actually do it. So the people who were arguing for it, no, we don't have to join Canada. There are lots of Irish Catholics in the United States. They'd probably want to have us. Those people couldn't get the relevant kind of assurances. And part of the way that that happened is that the United States was able to get the Canadians to promise a military base in Newfoundland, which was then subsequently granted. And then that gave the United States whatever it might be looking for in terms of security. And this was the middle of the 20th century. I think it was Truman who got the military base.
Oh, Truman.
Yeah, it was coming out of the Depression, the question about Newfoundlander independence, and that debate that was had at that point.
Yeah. Right.
It's
Of
the
course,
latest example I can think of a very serious attempt by somebody you might not think of
to
to join the
join,
United States.
to join. I mean, obviously, Hawaii and Alaska were made states under Eisenhower fairly late.
Yeah, though the territory was acquired much earlier.
Yeah,
So there was some basis for doing that. But to add territory, I think that's
right.
the last
That's right.
time I can think of in which it was really
Right. That's
properly
right.
thought about. I wanted to ask, because I think also you might be someone who could offer compelling definitions here about the
Mhm.
difference between a people, a society, and a nation. Could you schematize that, or would that be
That's a good one.
a bit much to ask you to do on short
No, I mean
notice?
it's a good one because in some ways I would I would tend at a theoretical level to prioritize society over people or nation, actually. Meaning that I think that people are subjects of society. In other words, a person, the rights of a person. What counts as a person? What counts as people, right? That those are, legal juridical agents in a society. However, I also think that society is not just legal juridical agents. In other words, I do think that social relations go on behind the back of actors, of the people. So, both in the bourgeois sense, in the sense of a kind of Mandeville or Smith invisible hand or Rousseauian general will, I think that's the case. It's also the case in capitalism, right? In other words, in capitalist alienation. So I prioritize society over people and nation. Now, nation, of course, that's why I argued earlier that the US isn't a nation like other nations, not only because it's the predominant capitalist country or polity, we could say, but also because it's not a nation state in the sense of a blood and soil nation state. It's not defined by its territory or by its descent, its ancestry, right? So the US could still be the US if after an asteroid hits, it has to relocate its polity to the South Pacific, right? So it could speak Chinese, be Muslim, and be on an entirely different territory and still be the United States, right? So it's not a blood and soil nation. Other nations are defined that way. They are. The US is not. Now, so nation, if we just say nation, that's like a people of a certain descent. That's what nation really means. And so what we have is in history, we have this question of polities that were not really national. Like the late Roman Republic and Roman Empire. Was it a national polity the way the Greek city states or the Macedonian Empire was? It was different. That this question of like, can people join what you're talking about? Like, can people join a polity without being part of the tribe? Because nations really are tribes. So, for instance, in Canada, they don't talk about Native Americans, they talk about First Nations. And why is it plural? Because, of course, the tribes are different, meaning there isn't like Native Americans as a nationality or as a nation. No, the tribes are the nations. Right. So
Yeah.
now people, again, people is much more of it's a late antiquity and then a bourgeois concept. It might also, obviously, in Christianity, there are notions of this as well. I'm not sure about the Mongolian Empire with respect to this, to the status of, peoples and nations, the polity. There are examples of what we would now call universalism, the universalism of the polity, as opposed to the particularism of the polity. So I associate nation with particularism as opposed to universalism.
What about in, say, SPQR, which of course
Right.
is
That's
invoked
right.
in the late Republican period. So
Right.
they had a
That's
notion
right.
of people, but also with the Senate as a distinct separate other. And then that becomes, late Roman
Exactly. So there's
republicanism and the Principate.
exactly. So there's an ambiguity to the Roman heritage with regard to this. And so it was both fulfilled but also very much not fulfilled in the medieval era and then resurrected in the bourgeois era, in the modern era. And I think that's important to, it's always, for me, I don't really believe in like Western civilization or Western history, because I think that the West has reinvented itself. And I think in the bourgeois era, it reinvented itself in a very selective way, the way it appropriated things from medieval Christendom and from classical antiquity is very selective. It's very much along the lines of what suited a kind of bourgeois practice and a bourgeois consciousness.
And this makes the concept of people untrustworthy because you can't be sure which way it's being deployed. And oftentimes people are slippery with it and they switch depending on what's convenient.
So the people's democracies, I mean, since we brought up neo-Stalinism, right? So if the USSR was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, well, Eastern Europe and China and Korea, North Korea, and Vietnam were people's republics, people's democracies. So there was a concession made to nationalism there that wasn't actually made in the Soviet Union per se. Right. And I think that's important to mark and to recognize, because the way those countries, those states came about after World War II, they did have a very specific conception of like a cross-class alliance forming the polity in a way that the Soviet Union didn't think of itself that way.
And this is something Haas both pointed to, but also he suggested that Lenin appreciated the peasants, but then he bigs up Maoism.
That's right.
Specifically on that basis.
I think that Haas is much more comfortable with a kind of like a Stalinist and a later Stalinist, like a post-World War II Stalinist conception, that they had to sort of jury rig a notion of people's democracies coming out of World War II, and they had to distinguish, like, in other words, why weren't they just absorbed into the Soviet Union? Because they should have been, right? Why they weren't was that it was understood that these countries were not ready for that they hadn't gone through a revolutionary process. They hadn't constituted themselves as a proletarian polity in the way the Soviet Union had. And so there was this idea of, a kind of, for instance, East Germany, the Socialist Unity Party was composed of the Communist Party and the Social Democrats. And so the idea was that East Germany was like, a people's democracy rather than a Soviet state or workers' council state, because it actually represented a kind of a cross-class alliance, because that's how they understood the difference between social democrats and communists. Is that the communists represented the working class, the social democrats represented the progressive middle class or petty bourgeoisie, as well as, to an extent, the working class. So they kind of fudged it. But then they had to stand behind it. They had to kind of give it justification, but I think it's still indicative. And that was on a case by case, in other words, on a national level. And each communist party in each like nation state in Eastern Europe had a conception of the stage of development that they were at, where they fit into the progress of history. And so it was like in East Germany, it was appropriate to have homosexuality decriminalized, because they were advanced enough to be able to do that. Whereas homosexuality had to be criminalized in Bulgaria and other Eastern European countries because they were backwards, and homosexuality was associated with the abuse of peasants and workers and children practiced under feudalism.
I do think there's also a tendency for states, once they get to a certain size and a certain position, to no longer be as interested in offering equal terms of cooperation to other states that fall into their sphere of influence.
That's true. That is true. And that is certainly the case. But the justification for it was the idea that each country had followed a different historical path of development. And of course, that's not really a Marxist view.
Similar to what Mill said about the colonies of the British Empire, that those populations had not gone through a process of progressing through history that would enable them to have seats in Parliament. Of course, even if they had, the British would have invented other reasons not to give them seats in Parliament. They were never going to give them seats in Parliament in any case.
Not sure that they would never have. So one of my polemical, provocative positions is I think decolonization was counter-revolutionary. I don't want to naturalize the Wilsonian system. The breakup of the empires and the creation of new national states, I want to say rather that they were forced after World War I and World War II, the European countries were forced to abandon their colonies, and they really abandoned them. And the post-colonial world had a very rough time until rather recently. So I would say that they cut their losses and ran. I think that's what happened. It wasn't some great national liberation for oppressed people who had been colonized. The colonizers cut and ran. And the French, to this day, are still getting payments from their former colonies to compensate for the costs of colonization. Do you know that?
Does that include Haiti?
Former French colonies.
Still?
Not
Right.
Haiti, not Haiti. I don't know.
Okay.
That was much too long ago. He's
Yeah.
talking about during the post
West
World War
Africa.
II. Yeah, decolonization. I do think this is a somewhat interesting point, because there was a period around, say, as late as turn of the 19th to 20th centuries, around 1900, where there were these quite significant, serious movements trying to get some level of representation for some of the colonies as a way of trying to quiet down independence movements in those states. But they were never picked up. And then the world wars happen, and the world wars weaken these states in such a way that you go from a position of being too strong to even think about it to so weak that you can't stop the independence movements at all. And if there had been a slower, more managed decline during that period, perhaps the window in which integration would have been considered could have popped up. Now, this is another interesting way to think about the United States. If you do think the United States is declining, then what you would expect to see is an attempt at territorial expansion, perhaps in response to that. And states that would previously be treated as part of a Delian League might instead look to be candidates for inclusion, to create new investment opportunities abroad. And that could be one way, not just of managing the decline of a state, but trying to arrest it and potentially even reverse it. And you might suggest that there are periods in history where states have done this, where their expansion has been driven by a desire not to decline. And I think that that happens quite a lot. It happens really very frequently.
Why it wouldn't happen now? So in capitalism, we have mass politics. And mass politics is a fractious business that lately is not very well managed. Meaning political parties used to be much more thoroughly organized and able to handle mass democracy in a way that they're not doing a great job of it, especially lately. So they've been in sort of secular decline for a long time, the parties, but they're especially in crisis now. So one of the major obstacles to the voluntary union of states now, you see it in the EU. The problem of the EU is that it's neither this nor that. It's neither merely an economic bloc, nor is it a proper political union. That there isn't the political will to bring it over the threshold into a true political union. And the reason that it's lacking is that the parties they don't penetrate society deeply enough to really organize the political will to affect it.
Yeah. And part of this is itself because of the public response to the EU. I think the really horrific paradox of the EU is that the EU doesn't have enough legitimacy to be able to govern. But then the fact that it doesn't have this legitimacy delegitimates the parties which submit to it.
Exactly.
And so those parties are then not able to organize in such a way as to fix the EU or to make it actually something which people could accept. And so it becomes this legitimation death spiral between the parties and the EU, between the nation states and the EU, where there's a lot of recrimination, but no movement.
I'll bring in Varoufakis again, because he tried to start a party. He's tried to start a kind of party movement, DM25, where basically it was a reform movement in order to make the EU properly politically unified. So it was meant to be a cross-European party that was going to affect a democratic political unification of Europe. And of course, it's not going anywhere, right? Because the other parties still exist to a sufficient extent to block it, right? And of course, my response is, no, there should be a socialist party organized in Europe, not a democratic party, because that's how it's defined. It's defined as a European-wide democratic party And I think we'll know. I'm an old-fashioned Marxist. I think this can only happen on the basis of a socialist movement and a socialist politics.
Yeah, I think something that a lot of older people who are still into the democratization language don't understand is that democracy itself is being destroyed as a value by this process, because neither the European Union nor the nation states are able to do things for people, and they are each constantly undermining each other's claims to legitimation. And in the course of this, it's not just that technocratic legitimacy is run down and turned into a fine paste, but the same is also true for democratic legitimacy, just for different parts of the population, different parties, different segments. But in any case, you get in anybody you talk to in Europe, one of these things or both of them has been thrown into deep disrepute.
Right. Brexit's a good example of that. Why it's neither here nor there, why it's sort of in suspense, because it can't be carried through because there really isn't a basis for it. It can only create fractiousness. It can only lead to the disintegration of the UK, meaning the Celtic countries will join the EU, Wales and Scotland maybe in particular, and leave the Anglos high and dry. Right. So, and you see with the Catalan as well, Catalonian independence. Yeah.
This is something about the demand for independence, or the demand for just democracy on its own, I think, in itself, because Evolution. It's not attached to anything more positive. Once you actually get the independence or you get the democracy, you have no idea what to do with it. You haven't organized on the basis of doing anything in particular. And so then as soon as you try to concretize that in a particular direction, you haven't actually constructed a social base on behalf of which you could do any of the various things. And so it becomes incredibly acrimonious. And then it just becomes a question of preserving order, meaning price stability.
That's right. Yeah. So that's my response to the people nation. Problem is that, I think of it as something that has to be actually constituted politically. And I think there are ideological issues I would take with the way these are usually mounted, especially as ways. I always think that these things are ultimately impelled, conditioned, driven by needs of capitalism. And so I think that the form that they take should be subject to critique.
All right, Chris.
To make that question central. Cool.
Thank you so much. I look forward to bringing you back to talk to all the stuff that kind of stacked up and is overflowing from here. Let's try to do it like next week or something. All right.
Great, guys. Thanks for having me on. I know that it was a little spontaneous.
No, it was awesome.
I'm always down for having you on, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Ben.
Take care.
Cool.
We'll be right back.
All right.
Everybody on the live side, we'll be right back right after this.
So that you can listen to special content that is not accessible to anyone else. Or if you go up a subscriber level, actually join in the discussions. Or at the top level, have us actually read your work, giving constructive feedback and ultimately paving a way to potentially being a part of what we call the turn. Then you'll want to become a subscriber. That's how you will access the ongoing courses and seminars. We've brought together Benjamin Studebaker's experience in political theory and science and philosophy with my critical social theory, phenomenology, existentialism, critique of political economy, critical media theory approach, combined with Michael Downes's fault line theory. The CCRU versus Ljubljana School, or Žižek versus Land. And of course, how he brings those against one another and then transcends them through other thinkers like Baudrillard, who he'll be teaching an intro course to in 2025. All of us are teaching stuff in 2025 that rhymes or argues or goes together. And so the best way to accelerate your development getting into theory right now is to just become a subscriber at TU. Just go to the website, click get involved, and I'm gonna look, this What I'm about to play for you all is a really special moment from our documentary that we're working on, an interview where Benjamin explains why he's supporting Theory Underground and getting involved as a active member here at the core of the teaching team.
Yeah. So the thing that I notice is that a lot of people criticize the university. They criticize the left. They don't build an alternative institution. They will go, the university sucks, but you know what's great? Substack and Patreon and YouTube. And they'll lean into that. But that is a negation, right? You guys don't do that. You guys are interested in sublating the university within the newly emergent media. Or you could frame it the other way, sublating the newly emergent media within the university, right? And so this, of course, will ultimately lead, if you take it where it goes, to a question of institutions and having actual economic, social role possibilities for theorists. This is the critical crisis, which is that there are still some very bright, very well-educated people, but they are not able to replace themselves. And because most of them have university positions, their level of interest in replacing themselves is to some degree compromised.
Yeah.
They don't have to worry that much about themselves. They don't have that much stake in it because they're already set up. However, because you aren't in the underground, you have some potential of being able to actually create an institution or structure which makes it possible for people to do theory in the future. This is something that, as far as I can tell, only you are doing. The thing about freeing Mikey from wage labor, this idea not only that your channel would free you from the Amazon job, but that this could grow in such a way that it could provide spaces for multiple people, and then those multiple people could interact in the way that they would in a monastery or in a university department. This is the revolutionary idea in terms of raising consciousness and making it possible for us to think in such a way that we could return even to the horizons of the tens and talking about things like Medicare for all in a not stupid, not bullshit way, in a serious way. To get to that point, we need to raise our level of ability to think. We need new intellectuals in our generation that are real intellectuals and not people who are running around scared of what the DSA or their university department thinks of them. You have the potential to actually make a real material intervention into not just knowledge production, but in Bildung, into the making of people. Yeah. This is something that we can do. There's a window right now where I am not in the university, and so I have a real reason to think very seriously about, can we do something else? Because I'm annoyed, myself with the whole process of trying to be in that. And I would like there to be something else, something better. I have all my critiques of it that come in part from being at Cambridge, in part from studying ancient thinkers. We could do something better than it. Not just something that is an imitation or steals some things from it and does the best you can with it, but something that actually is better and that produces the kind of theory that in modernity, how do you make a Hegel? How do you make a Marx? We have to reinvent this. It's no longer possible to do that. We've got to, I think, actually institutionalize in a material way, and this is the sense in which I will uphold the kernel of materialism, actually giving a shit about the structure and what kind of structure is necessary to give rise to a form of life in which this kind of really, really good work can be produced.
Things, and I think we're good now. So it's recording. Welcome, everybody, at Theory Underground, as well as the random passerby who's wondering what the heck all of this stuff is about. It's great to have you here. The Theory Underground crew has been hard at work, and I, as its major labor force for the last couple of years, have been hard at work trying to make sure that you are able to get based at Theory Underground without having to just spend hundreds of hours going through our back catalog of MSTUs, without having to go through our back catalog of courses and seminars. And so to that end, allow me to show you how you can get based at Theory Underground. I have it up here. It says 2025, get based in philosophy and theory, the TU base braid we are weaving for the year. And there are 4 courses, or 4 major threads is a way of saying it. The core concepts of Theory Underground, which I am teaching in 12 parts. Fault Line Theory 101, which Mikey is teaching in 12 parts. Or actually, most of that was already taught in Intro to Zizek and Intro to Land, and you'll have access to those playlists as well as his seminar. And then Political Theory 101 taught by none other than Benjamin Studebaker, and Philosophy of Nature taught by Nina Power. We love her. We love him. We love all these people. It's all really cool. But here's the image of the bass braid. You can see it right here. Can everybody see that? Can you see that? It's right there. Check it out. That is the bass braid. Right there. We are the silent weaving of the spirit in our seminars, taking these courses and ideas and bringing them into dialogue, figuring out what are the contradictions that constitute the field between us. And in doing so, we open up a new space with a new horizon of possibilities. Philosophy of nature versus postmodernism. Political theory versus the situation. These are the threads that we are weaving at Theory Underground, and the only way to get involved, the only way to get involved in all of that, or any one of those courses or seminars, is the same one-click subscription. Just go to theoryunderground.com and click the Get Involved button you see right here, or go to theoryunderground.com/subscribe. Or you could always just use the QR code that's right here, or the QR code that's right here. Just put your finger on it from the screen. Chances are your smartphone might be able to pop up the link. Go to subscribe and become a $50 subscriber to access all this stuff at the listening level, to be able to engage in the Zoom calls. Go ahead and sign up at the next higher tier. And then finally, the highest tier is for people who want to be able to undergo supervisions to eventually, hopefully, get onto the Turn or the Agora or any of the other cool Bildung mech that we've been developing here at Theory Underground as we figure out how to do something more than just a YouTube channel, something more than just a podcast, something more than just a Substack or an Instagram. No, it's about real human beings who have real needs. Real needs. Mikey is our poster child of those real needs. He was a human being who had his time, energy, his freedom, and he was able to study philosophy for 15 years full time, like an obsessive, 7 hours a day on average, 7 days a week for 15 years. Jealous. I'm jealous. I'm jealous. We're all jealous. He is jealous because he doesn't get to do that anymore. He's working in a warehouse. He's been working there for 5 years, 7 years, something like that. Point is to free Mikey from wage labor means Theory Underground becoming a success, which also means me getting freed from wage labor, which thankfully you've all done. Thank you to you subscribers. And then also Anne, bringing her on in her administrative capacities until she's able to train someone else to do it, and we're able to pay them. And at that point, I'll have some Skole, which is something that time energy becomes the condition of possibility for, right? Time energy is the condition of possibility for what is called labor power, but it's also the condition of possibility for what is called Skole. Skole is free of outside pressures, incentives, and is just able to be in a sort of leisurely kind of frame of mind. You can read all about it when you go to Free Time by Theodore Adorno. It's a wonderful little essay. And Joseph Piper's Leisure as the Basis of Culture is a good example of this as well. But I take it to another level with time energy theory. And so you want to get the time energy book. It's on Amazon or Audible. And then you can really understand what we're doing here at Theory Underground. Mikey is writing currently this book. He's finishing up a book called Capital versus Time Energy, a Zizkian critique of Nick Land. Though time energy is not a Zizkian concept, it is one that he likes and has, written a foreword for my book on because he loves the concept. And, so ultimately, thank you, Slavoj, for showing that support. But Mikey is the residential Zizkian Landian. He is somebody who has really tarried with the two sides of the fault line between Zizek and Land. And so we want to free Mikey so he's able to do the best lectures on the goddamn internet. But that's not going to be possible until we get to 80 platinum subscribers. So right now, I think we've got about under 10. We've got under 10 right now. We need to get to 80. So we could do that this year. And then Mikey will be doing weekly exegeticals and office hours and potentially a podcast with me, which is very exciting. But with all that said, let's get into the real stuff here, the stuff that I really want to do with you all. Let's get back to it. Thanks for listening to me explain how everything works. Now let's go. All right, we're back. Before we start the recording for this episode, I just wanted to say hello to everybody who waited around through 2 PSAs. I don't usually do 2 PSAs back to back, but we had to make sure that we were situated technically and technologically. So here we are. We got it together. We're excited for what we're about to get into, and we'll start the recording in just a second. But for all of you who are like, but for real, 2 PSAs, don't worry about it, all right? This is a very special month in terms of Theory Underground and braiding that rope, so to speak, right? It's going to be a lot of fun. So get involved. The time is now. But with that said, Anne, I'm going to hit the record button in 3, 2.
Let's do it.
Go for it.
What's up, everyone on the internet and off of it? I think that's just the intro now. My name is Anne Snellgrove McKerracher.
And I'm David McKerracher. You're listening to What's Right. Today, we're going to be talking about an episode. Sorry, not an episode. Jesus Christ. Today we're going to be talking.
Technically.
Yeah, I guess. But today we're going to be talking about Homestead, which is it's a movie. How do I even describe it? Well, we have a trailer pulled up for you all, and I think we're just going to watch the trailer really quick. But the short version is, this is like an American conservative like fantasy playing itself out. But there's a twist. And I think that by talking about that, especially in the aftermath of the last episode where we had Nina Power on and we talked about the constitution of the contemporary right, this is going to be a really interesting sort of almost socio-analytic dig into the minds of American conservatives. Anything you want to say before we get into the trailer, Anne?
Nothing other than I'm excited for this conversation. It was a movie that we probably normally wouldn't see, but where we live, we have really cool access to like a unlimited pass at the movie theater for $20 a month, and we can just go see as many movies as we want to see. And in the United States, a normal movie ticket costs like $12, so 1.5 movies pays for this. So we probably wouldn't have seen this movie without that pass. But we get to go see a lot more interesting things. So yeah. Dave saw it before me. Dave said, "You gotta come see this so we can have a conversation about it." And here we are.
But don't worry, everybody. If you don't have a sweet movie pass like that, and you have to be a little more conservative about what you go watch, well, don't worry. We watched it for you. So you'll actually get all the good parts without the bad part. The bad part is paying for it, and so we'll
True.
We'll spoil it for you. You know, it's gonna be a lot of fun. With that, let's pull it up. Let's make sure you can see it here, and boom, we're gonna hit play.
What do you think?
Where did you find that?
In the dark corner of your closet? We'll probably never get asked to prom. San Evie.
This is happening in LA, and it is not just an earthquake.
Los Angeles has been struck by a bomb.
The city's on fire.
Take a breath.
What is this place?
Welcome to Homestead. So glad you're here.
This might be the most prepared location in the Rockies.
My family's out here, and we're starving to death.
Everyone's gonna want in.
I wish we could help, but we can.
You can or you won't. Please.
After today, our lives will never be the same.
Our kids need us to be strong.
Can I pray for you?
I can't just sit here while our friends are starving. There's a life And then there is life worth living. It would take a miracle for this to work.
It's just you and I tonight.
But I believe in miracles.
All right. So,
I had never actually seen the trailer before the movie.
what do you make of that? Yeah. What anything surprise you about the trailer compared to
Yeah, the trailer almost gives away the ending of the movie because the whole time in the movie, which we can get more specific, I suppose, you don't think it's gonna end the way it's gonna end. You think it's gonna be this like conservative fantasy. Maybe you can touch on that a little bit right now. Or I don't know if we want.
I'll say that I think that the conservative fantasy, I would say that there's two versions of a conservative fantasy in tension through this film. That they're both conservative, they're both fantasies, but that the contradiction shows us something important about America. Now, but with that said, really quick, and you're really good at these sort of summaries, right? So like, how about you just, everyone, if you actually care about spoilers about a movie like this, you just need to get the fuck out of here. We don't care about you. But, I'm sorry for cussing. We're going to dedicate this one to my mom. Mom, I shouldn't be cussing on the air. And the fact is I know that my mom is going to end up listening to this episode. And it's kind of funny because she should have seen this. She should have been like, Dave, you got to watch Homestead. Instead, it's going to be like me going like, Mom, do you know about this movie?
Mom, you got to watch this movie.
Because in a sort of sense, this is getting at like something about her fantasy of homesteading and pioneering and out here in the West. And so with that said, Mom, you're gonna get a lot out of it. If you don't want the spoilers, go ahead and drop out now. But the thing is my mom has never cared about spoilers. She's gonna be totally fine. So let's take it away.
Then let's get to it. Quick synopsis of the movie. It starts off, actually it was very dark watching this movie on the day that we did, which was just a couple days ago, because it starts off in I don't remember the exact city, but like one of the cities that is literally on fire right now in California. It takes place there, and it's just like kind of a normal, like wealthy, upper middle class family. The girl's trying to make plans with her friend, the mom's, on her phone, whatever. Like all the kids are kind of doing their thing. And that's a lie. The movie starts actually with these two guys, unsure what country they're from, and they're on a boat, they're speaking another language, and they're like, we have to do this for our family. And the Coast Guard is like coming at them. They're like, this is the Coast Guard, stop. And they end up setting off a big old massive bomb in the ocean that there were probably more bombs, but like Los Angeles, Southern California, it's going down. Like rumbles, power goes out, sky's all bleak and stormy. There's big like mushroom plummet clouds. And so this family is like, get in the car, get the dog, we're driving to my sister's house. And then you kind of forget about them for a little bit. Then we see this other family, a little bit more of a dysfunctional family. The dad's you find out that the dad works within the military to some capacity. And he has three kids, I think, a younger kid, like a teenage son, younger boy, a teenage son. And then what I picked up on is like an adopted daughter who has maybe something going on. Trauma. And he gets a call, or he's like, something happened. We have to go to the homestead, to Ian Ross. That's the owner of the homestead. So they're like, this is Jeff. Well, I have got the characters pulled up here. Jeff Erickson and his family. They're like, we gotta go. They get in the car. And you come to find out that this homestead is somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. Like it's fallen apart in the rest of the United States. And this guy, the owner of this homestead, has hired a team of like soldiers to be his personal security on his property if it hits the fan. Your mom might be watching, so I'm not
My
gonna
mom,
say
no,
what I
my
would
mom,
normally say.
my mom always uses this hilarious word, Schumer. If the Schumer hits the fan.
If the
Yeah.
Schumer hits the fan, the Schumer has hit the fan, and so they drive to the homestead. And then you see one more family, and so all these people are like making their way to the homestead in different capacities. Well, the homestead in the trailer has the mom, dad, and then the teenage daughter who like tried on the purple prom dress. And long short of it is you kind of learn about the homestead. They make all their, bread and wheat, and it's a big, like, this isn't just like a little humble
mansion
farm. This is like a freaking mansion. They've got 20 to 30 people like permanently living and employed there. So it's like a little mini business. Just some kind of conservative cowboy kind of folk, but not uber like conservative, not uber cowboy. But you start to see this tension with all these people coming between the very, very security oriented like military group and like, no, we gotta secure the property. Other people are gonna be roaming like the up on the hills. And the owner, Ian's like, well, that's BLM land. It might just be hunters. That's the right. He's like, no, you gotta secure the property. You gotta secure the perimeter. People are gonna be coming. They're gonna be hungry. They want your stuff. The owner is like doing all this math and calculations of what they have. Like, ooh, are we gonna have enough to feed our own staff and family? And then you have the wives or the women who are like, because people are starting to show up at their property, friends, neighbors, and like, please help us, please give us some food. And the wives are like, we should help them. We should give them some food. We should give them something. Look, this stuff in the fridge that's going bad. Let's give it to these families. They're wanting to help. So there's this like immediately this tension between security and helping thy neighbor. Like protecting their own personal property, helping others, helping the community. At one point in the movie, the son, his name is Abe, of the like security military guy, he gets put on the perimeter duty. And there's a hunter who's aiming a gun at him who he didn't know it was just a hunter. They tried to warn him. Like,
the hunter is an idiot who was just trying to see what was up the hill through the scope. And so from their standpoint, there's a guy pointing a gun at them. So like he walkie-talkies into his dad and he's like,
and the dad's like, shoot him, you gotta shoot. Like,
yeah.
So this guy gets killed on the property. It gets like they're all escalating it to this, oh, people are coming onto the property, when it was just a hunter. And so now this son is traumatized because he's just killed someone who had no malintent. At the same time, the government's coming onto the property and they're like, we need to see all registered weapons. Is this a lot? Like, how many people you got on the premises? This is an illegal operation, blah blah. So they're trying to intervene. At one point in the movie, the SWAT team comes, and there's another like
with that same government guy, and as far as bad guys go, it's pretty much just this one government guy, except he's a bureaucrat, right? But there is this, I mean, we'll find out through the course of the story that there's another bad guy in a sort of sense. I'll explain what I mean later, but okay. I just kind of want to explain for a second the scene where you find out about this government agent. So the main character, Ian Ross, is downstairs counting his various currencies and all of his food rations and his guns and whatnot. And then he hears this voice, and he steps into this other room adjacent to the room he's in. And this room is wall-to-wall guns. Like, this guy has an armory. And the guy standing there is like this government guy from like downtown, basically. And that guy's like sitting here saying, you need to have licenses for all this stuff and everything. Well, once he leaves, the security guy's all, what was he saying about SWAT? And basically, he's like, oh, don't worry about him. It's all bark, no bite. It's just a bureaucrat. And then the security guy says, he'll be back. That guy was hungry. And then it turns out to be true. He does come back. He is hungry, and he does bring SWAT with him. So, yeah.
That is true. So that kind of brings us to like the climax of the movie. There are families outside. The moms, the various mom, the mom who lives on the homestead, the moms of the other, I'm just calling them the moms, the women, are like actively kind of trying to feed these people. They're making bread to give people loaves of bread from their wheat, and this bureaucrat comes back and SWAT team, and it's a big arms pulled kind of standoff that ends with Ian Ross, the owner of the homestead, being shot. And so he's out of commission for like 10 days, like perhaps in a coma, but he ends up living. Well, in that time, and I guess I want to share like here. Okay, so this whole time I'm watching the movie and I'm starting to notice this again, this tension between like security and private property versus helping other people. And it is this gendered tension. The men, these strong masculine figures, like, no, gotta secure the perimeter. This is dangerous. People are gonna want our stuff. And the women are like, our friends are out there. Our neighbors are out there. They're going hungry. There's children. We need to help them. And so I'm sitting here going, what is gonna happen? I'm thinking that we're gonna find out that the security guys were right and that the women were silly, stupid women. Like I was picking up on these vibes from this movie. I'm like, it's gonna end up being this, oh, silly women wanting to help the neighbors. But what it turns out is while Ian Ross, who's down and out of commission for 10 days, his wife ends up reworking some math and numbers, and she lets and it's not like there's hundreds of people. There's, I don't know, 10 different families maybe outside of distant friends and neighbors. She lets everyone in and she decides, no, we have to help them. We'll get through this through love and community, but also let's use their skills. So they end up building this new greenhouse with like fire, like one of their friends works in place installments, and so he installs some ovens so they can bake their bread in the greenhouse to keep it warm enough to grow food year round. And so like they use everyone's skills to supply more food so that there's enough food for everyone. Like this scarcity mindset, she's like, no, we can overcome that by using everyone to help grow food so we can all have food. But here's, I guess, where like the faith-based part comes in, because she's like, she had like a coming to Jesus moment. Like the movie already had its kind of religious undercurrents. Like in the trailer, you saw the girl saying, the daughter Claire saying like, can I pray for you? So there's a little bit of this like every now and then a line of dialogue that's like, I'll pray for you, or only God knows. But she's like the divine, my prayers were answered. God gave me this answer. So it was like this divine spiritual message that she perceived to be, discovering, that said, no, we have to help. And so that's the end of the movie. Goes to black, the end. And then immediately one of the characters comes on stage, comes onto the screen. He's kind of goofy, silly. And he goes, hi, I'm this actor. Who is it? Jesse Hutch. I played Evan Lee in the movie you just watched, Homestead. Did you like this movie? Well, the end is just the beginning. This was actually the first episode of a TV series where you can watch the rest of this journey on TV. Here, if you scan this QR code right here on the screen and donate one movie viewing of Homestead to someone who might not be able to see it, because our important message needs to be shared, then you'll get immediate access to the next episode that picks right back up where this show ended. And that seems to get into, like, it seems darker. You find out like this adopted daughter. Yeah.
I want to talk about how weird that was really quick. And so let me let me click this button and change it. So I want to show everybody what it was like, because this, in terms of marketing, was actually kind of, it was weird. Okay, so I mean, there's this whole other side of things, which is the way that advertising is getting now in the theater, like the kinds of commercials that we were seeing, it was all unprecedented as far as I could tell. Unprecedented. Like we've never seen anything like it. And so here, let me pull up the so people can see what I'm talking about here. So this is what you see at the end. You see one of these main characters, or the actors, all looking like a militia dude, talking about paying it forward. Sorry, let's yeah. And so basically he's talking about how if you scan this QR, so the movie ends, it says the end, and then it says is just the beginning, and then it turns into a trailer, and the trailer shows a whole bunch more stuff that with these exact same characters continuing the plot line, just as Anne was getting into, which we'll get right back to in a second. But then it's got this guy who comes on and starts talking about how you can pay it forward so that someone else during this Christmas season is able to see this movie. Just scan this QR code, and in return, we'll give you access to this show. And basically, this movie becomes the pilot for the show on their private streaming platform,
which is Angel Studios, I believe.
Absolutely wild to see that in a movie theater. I've never seen anything like that. It's genius marketing as far as, I mean, these Christians, they're taking over the movie theaters. We were on Swole's channel not too long ago talking about Am I Racist? Matt Walsh's blockbuster comedy Bo-Rat knockoff kind of hit.
That was the most populated I've seen a movie theater in Idaho, where we live, in a while, was that Am I Racist documentary.
Right. So, you know, they really are taking over, and it's very interesting. And so anyway, okay, let's continue with the plot line.
It gets into like this daughter maybe having had visions that this explosion was already going to happen. Like, there's a whole, the plot just continues, but that's essentially the movie. To sum it up, natural disaster, everyone wants the help of the homestead guy. The homestead guy has this security force. There's, the daughter of the homestead guy and the son of the security guy. There's a little romance going on, and like there's these dynamics, and an actual kind of plot plays out between the characters, but like overall that's kind of the arc of the movie, and it ends with let everyone in, help everyone. Like, we're the women, we got this, we'll take care of it. But I think I don't know, do we want to get right into like my immediate response to that? Is there something you want to say about all of that?
I'll just say that this is kind of close to home for me, because I grew up in a family that was very shaped by the fears of Y2K, and not just Y2K, but also just, the kind of evangelical conservative Christian concern, or not concerns even, like it's almost like hopes, right? Like they hope for the end times, and they believe the end times are coming, and that Jesus is going to return, and then they think it's going to be Y2K, and then they think it's going to be some other time, and then but the point is Jesus will come back when you're least expecting it, guys. And so all you can do is prepare, and of course that usually kind of results in some kind of prepping. And I think my parents have kind of become a lot more taken with the growing food for the local community angle of things, as opposed to just this kind of prepping thing. And when they were more militant in their conservatism, it was a lot more like focus on prepping and homeschooling. Whereas now that they're grandparents and they're kind of settling, it's more about just the farming side of things. There's a little bit of that prepping mentality still that will surface. But the part that always bothered me, especially when I was like this bleeding heart little liberal kid, was just like, I was so put off by the kinds of sort of economizing, budgeting kind of, and this is where the wish fulfillment fantasy structure kind of comes in, of like, oh, everyone's going to come knocking at our door. Everyone's going to want some of what we got. We're going to have to fight people off. We'll get to choose who we want to bring on to be a part of our little clan. And like that part of things just always made me sick to my stomach. And so I was watching this, and I was weirded out by the narrator. Like the whole first, so I didn't go to the movie theater to watch this movie. I went to the movie theater because the movie theater with this $20 pass has become like I treat it like a free third space. Like I'll just work on my laptop and stuff. And when I saw it, I was like, I might as well check it out. And so I walked into it late. So I missed like the first 5 minutes of the movie. I got there pretty much on time for the nukes going off, or the nuke going off, not plural. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. This is definitely like kind of something that I could see my parents telling me I should watch. And so I'm watching it, and there were parts that were kind of corny as expected with these kind of smaller budget Christian movies. But I was also surprised by how much of it was like actually pretty good production value, and that they actually had good actors. I mean, I'm not gonna say amazing actors, but I'm gonna say it's like compared to like 1990s or early aughts kinds of Christian films, the acting had gone up a level, and it was very obvious. And I was like, geez. And then
it was like a well done movie. I've seen
like surprising
way worse movies. I'd even say it was a good, like all things considered, like a fine film with good performances and good production. There were moments where I was like, the pacing was weird and they totally abandoned this character here, but in the context of a TV show, that makes sense. But with a movie, I was like, oh yeah, they kind of totally forgot about this plot line with this weird daughter. But all things considered, yeah, it was like not a bad movie.
There were two kids because there's also like a little brother in that family, and you only see him like briefly at one point, and then they bring him in randomly at some other point, and the way that it dwelled on him when they do bring him back in, it was like, I was like sitting there, I was like, what is he doing here? Like, what is, yeah. I'm sorry, you guys, I forgot this kid exists. And then the girl with the superpowers is also like, yeah, there were a couple threads that,
but
one of the things you didn't mention, which is worth touching on, is the story, especially in the first like 40 minutes, follows a couple of families making their way to the homestead. One of them leaves ahead of the husband, or they get separated, and they take off in their Tesla, and then they end up at this gas station where there's like people fighting over what remains of the gasoline, fighting over what remains of the food, and literally fighting, and they're like sitting there with their battery ran out and they don't know what to do. Tesla. And so the mom makes this hard decision and says, all right, get to the eldest daughter, get your kid, get the kids, get them into this other, and they steal an SUV. And as they take off, like the man comes running out of the gas station, and he's like, no. And then they throw money.
And the mom's like, throw him some money. And so they just throw a bunch of dollar bills out the window at him.
And then that guy like falls on the ground and like stands up crying and like, what? And it's really heartbreaking, and it's kind of gnarly. It was like, geez Louise, I didn't expect it to be so like, that's pretty rough.
So there's moments like that. You find out also like the dad of this family, who, because he's at work when all this happens, like he can see the explosion kind of from his work window. So he's the one who calls home and says, honey, get the kids, go right now to your sister's house. So he comes after the fact, and he's like, oh yeah, I stopped in Las Vegas on the way, and was like having a grand old time in Las Vegas because the power was still on in Vegas because of all their generators or whatever. Which I was also like, that's so American. That is like the world is ending, but fucking Viva Las Vegas, baby. You can go get your slots on.
And you know how like in these kind of conservative movies, there's always got to be a moral to the plot, and that a lot of these characters become like allegories or like stand-ins for broader social tendencies. That dude is very much like the guy who stopped in Vegas on the way, and he's trying to act all nonchalant. Well, as I was coming, he's very clearly like supposed to be like this kind of liberal, psychedelic adjacent, like not serious about life guy. And now that he's off his meds, he's all like in his own world.
There's this line that's like, he's not on his medication right now. That's like, huh.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to be
Yeah.
fair, these people do exist. You know, we know plenty of them. But anyway,
Sure,
yeah. So
Yeah,
what did you make?
things.
I guess I'll just say it this way. So I grew up in a family where this kind of theme of like security is conservatism. Caring about the people closest to you is conservatism. Of course, also God and country. But with that said, I was very surprised when this narrator, who I didn't even understand how the narrator was a part of the story until later, when I was like, oh, that's the wife of Ian Ross. Oh, okay. And then of course she turns out to be the true protagonist of the whole story. You think it's Ian Ross. Actually, Ian Ross is just fucking everything up by being a greedy, hoarding, security fixating kind of guy. And it turns out she's like the hero. And I was like, I was like, wow, I knew I would have really liked that if I was a kid. And I also was thinking I would have loved to see how my parents would have reacted to that back when they were way more like preppers. But for you, this is all kind of outside of your world, Anne. So I really am just like, what do you make of it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's become more a part of my world through just getting to know your family and your parents and their politics and their lifestyle and the lifestyle like we will soon be kind of more in that environment of living on a farm, living off the land, not to the same extent of the people in this movie. So it's definitely kind of become part of my world, but this like thinking about security versus loving thy neighbor, helping other people, like you said, that's like a conservative thing, but it's like in my upbringing and then some of the political messages that I picked up on, it's like that was always the liberal thing, is you help other people, like come an emergency, you help your neighbors. The conservatives are going to be the ones who are going to board up their houses, and that's even how it gets portrayed in certain films. Like there's one that came out on Netflix in the last year or two, and I can't remember the title right now, but it's another like world's ending, and just in trying to go to other people's houses for any sort of help, but they're like guns ablaze, and they're kind of portrayed as these conservative Trump rural figures, like get off, you need to get off my property right now. So that's always kind of been the only narrative about the conservative role in that hypothetical situation, whereas the communities will help everyone. And so I don't think that's true. Like there are reasons that people would be kind of more private or protective of their property, and there's reasons that people have in that they would want to open their doors, and I think both are legitimate, and I would probably side more with the let's help each other. But like, you're not a bad person necessarily if you're like, no, I would just look out for my family and my things. With all that aside, so I was like I was just there. Like I said, I didn't watch the trailer. I was just there for the ride, there for the experience, and I'm sitting there watching the movie going, oh, here we go, some like this masculine fantasy that, oh, look, the wives were wrong actually, and we were right all along. The SWAT team came, and we need to be more protective. Like that's where I saw the movie going. So the ending was actually like a pleasant surprise for me. I love movies that kind of show femininity or characteristics that we associate with femininity as the hero of the story. It's one of the reasons why I loved the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, because spoiler alert, the movie's action-packed and fighting, and it culminates in this big fight scene where the mom has to fight her daughter, who's this like evil kind of figure. And she does it. She chooses like love and silliness and gets to her daughter to embrace her rather than to have this epic battle. And I thought that was excuse me, like a really powerful message. Like we always say, oh, love is the answer, peace, love, and happiness. But no, actually, taking that seriously. And I think this movie, Homestead, did that with my caveat, but I'll just say, yeah, like the wife is like, no, we brought everyone in, we helped everyone, we collaborated, and we made a functioning greenhouse that will last us the whole winter, and everyone has a place here. And I was like, oh, that's powerful. But then the part that I was like, oh, this is kind of corny though, is because like the wife doesn't even give herself credit for this idea necessarily. I wish we had the exact lines of what she said, and maybe you remember more because you saw it twice, but she's like, just like she found the answer in Christ. This was all God's doing. And it's like, no, it's like, lady, you've been advocating for this the whole time. Like give yourself some credit. So that's where it is kind of this like, oh, it was God. And it's like, sure, I can appreciate that message. But I think in the moment it was just portrayed as kind of corny and like downplaying the idea that just care and love is the answer because it's the right thing to do, because like for a lot of different non-secular reasons than just, oh, because God said so. Like that's kind of the message. God said we need to help everyone. No, like not because it's right, because she knew the whole time. And there's some of that in there, but that I think was the main thing that like rubbed me the wrong way, but also didn't rub me that wrong because I think the message still stands that it was like, if you can connect the dots, you can go, okay, well, the women were advocating for this the whole time. Clearly they were in touch with some, morals or some lessons from the Bible or from God or Jesus, if we're going to accept that that's their worldview. Like, they were more in touch with that the whole time, and the guys were doing their little LARPing security military fighter thing. But I was surprised by that ending, especially from a conservative Christian film, post-apocalyptic story. I was pleasantly surprised by how it ended.
Yeah. Now what I have is just a little grab bag of different comments. So I'm going to just take a couple of them and bring them together here. But first I want to shout out Caravaggio in the chat, who said something I did not think of, and that is such a fucking funny point, man. He said, hold on, let me pull it up. Where'd it go? Caravaggio, did you delete that? Hold on. Ah, here we go. No, Caravaggio said, the wife was wrong. She just doesn't know it yet. Hence the TV show. So it's possible,
And that is the thing. I think like that's the problem with making a movie and then having, because the trailer portrayed a very different looking TV show, like different thematically. There was fighting, it was dark, there's like this supernatural element with the daughter. So I imagine because we know this world goes on, like they've created this world to go on, we're gonna find out that the security threats are more serious than what was explored in the movie. But if we say the story ends here, like that was the message.
Yeah.
But yeah, they almost can't, like, by taking the story on further, they almost they potentially are going to undermine the message that they were trying to share in the movie by going, oh, but actually there's more. And I think this is just a problem in general of kind of constantly having sequels and reboots and 9+ seasons of a TV show. It's just like choose your strong ending and then end it there and create something new. If you have other messages to share, do it in a different medium. But like there's something really powerful, I think, to when a director, when a producer, when a writing team can create a strong story and keep it strong with the message that they want to punch home from beginning to end. And it's the reason why Dave and I really like the show The Good Place. It was 4 seasons long. It was a popular TV show. Everyone wanted it to go on longer. And the writers said, no, this is our story. It has a beginning, it has an end, and every single episode was good. Like they didn't ruin it. Whereas some shows, like Glee, okay, like Glee is one that I've watched I think 3 times in my life. I will watch it again. It's a garbage TV show, but it's also iconically incredible. I love it. They went 3 seasons too long, and the show was ruined, and character arcs were undermined, and it was garbage, hilarious garbage.
Game of Thrones.
And so like that, I don't know. I think this is interesting how they're kind of playing into that. Oh, we have this message to share. And I think the movie, like we said, the movie was good for what it was, all things considered. We probably have our religious disagreements, our political disagreements, but that was their message. And now they want to go, oh, but actually it's really dark and complicated. And that's interesting in itself, the way in which I think the medium of like streaming service and television based entertainment that we seem to have really I don't want to say fallen into, but there's so much new TV shows all the time. Like I'm so over it. I don't care anymore. And so they kind of play into that as well, which is I think a problem perhaps for their message and for what this movie was trying to accomplish.
Yeah. I guess in the last 5 minutes here, I want to say a couple other things. Left Behind, the movies. Fireproof. Who brought that up in the chat? Shout out. And God's Not Dead, 1, 2, 3, and 4. These are examples of these attempts at culture hacking the theater system and Hollywood on the part of not mainstream Christians, right? These are not mainstream, but they're doing a lot. I mean, evangelical Christians are not the silent majority in this country, right? But they have a huge impact, and the fact that their budgets are getting bigger and that their actors are getting better and their plots are now breaking certain narratives. It's all very interesting to me, but I'm also fascinated by the smart capitalism here, the platform capitalism here. This is the first movie I've ever seen that ended with a QR code beside the main actor talking about, oh, this was the pilot, it keeps going. And that way of taking over the movie theater and siphoning people onto a private platform is really cool. I'm not saying I'm getting any ideas from it or anything, but we were literally already talking about something kind of similar with our Coliseum idea a couple weeks ago. So, you know, nothing. We're not going to say anything publicly about that. But I also want to say the mom of Mrs. Ross, we'll call her that, Mrs. Ross. On this whole note about giving, how she could have given herself that credit instead of God. I did see it twice. So for me, you know, I had these kind of eyes that I didn't have the first time. So I was paying attention to her a little bit more, and she said things like, to him, there were a couple disagreements she had with Ian Ross early into the movie, where she was basically like saying like, is this a fortress or is this a haven or something like that, right? And then she brought up faith, and that was in the beginning. And so I think to steelman the Christian position here, the natural or almost inevitable response to your criticism, Anne, is that Mrs. Ross either wouldn't have had the idea or advocated for it or kind of held to that principled position throughout the movie had it not been for faith, or if she was the kind of person who would have advocated for all of that through the whole process, but then she would have given herself that credit, then that would have undermined the situation in some way. And the reason I want to bring this up is because it's kind of like when Nance will say, you know, no, it's not God, it's us. We're doing these things. And I think that there's like a kind of Christian response that goes, even if that's so, this is more pragmatist than most Christians will ever kind of say, but like, even if so, humans who are full of themselves are not great humans. And so displacing your good side onto something else and then taking on, being like, I serve that good thing, it's not me. There might be a social function to that. That's the idea. And I want to say that I am
For sure, yeah.
open to such ideas because my experiences with secular people is that they're not much better than Christian people, except that they are, in some cases, more full of themselves. However, Christians can very well be like, oh, God told me, and then and really it's their own narcissistic interests that they're mobilizing under the name of God. So it is complicated, and I'm instantly...
Yeah, and I think the movie, like I said, I think throughout the movie leading up to this, you could kind of see that she already was advocating for this. I think just the moment in the end was like the way it was framed, and like I said, I wish I knew the exact words she said, but it was very much like, I didn't know what to do. And then the message came, and I knew exactly what to do. And it's like, but you knew to do this the whole time. I'm not saying she should have been like, I told you so, motherfucker, to her husband who just was shot. But I feel like it could have taken this more, it still could have been a faith-based kind of revelation. But the way at least I remember it, that for my one viewing, it was just like, and there's a specific word that she used. Again, I can't remember, but just like, the message came so clear. I like that it was like, oh, this idea was popped into my head and I let them all in. Like, so that, of course, it was dramatized to like prove this point, I think. And it was done like, the fact that the message still came through, that it was still like care and community, and it was like the women taking on this role. I think that still came through. I don't think it was clouded so much by this like divine intervention. I just thought the divine intervention of it all was a bit overplayed. But I agree with I like see what you're saying and agree with what you're saying for the most part.
Last things, it was sponsored by Black Rifle Coffee, which is hilarious because it's
the
like
movie?
Well, it was like product placement. Like if you watch, like they were wearing clothing from Black Rifle Coffee. Yeah. So.
Oh, I didn't see. I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, it's like it's like a Christian conservative evangelical kind of like coffee brand that just it's because coffee has been taken over by woke, and so like they're like the anti-woke. It's so stupid. Anyway, miracle. Except with that said, I'd probably rather go on a long car ride with your average Black Rifle Coffee drinker than your average push and pour or whatever, your average progressive Blue City polyamorous person or whatever. We overhear.
Correct.
We overhear them every time we go to the coffee shop. We know what it is.
Yeah.
I want to close on this. On this note, that the part that you like about it, Anne, and the part that I think is so interesting, it's that they weren't just calling the people outside of the gate neighbors or friends or hungry strangers. They used the word refugee, and then they literally let in all of the refugees, and the refugees solved all of their problems. That is the most anti-build the wall sentiment I've ever seen in a Christian conservative film. That to me feels like a huge rebranding effort that might not be anti-MAGA, might still be MAGA. I mean, Black Rifle Coffee Company sure seems MAGA to me, but I just want to point that out. Yeah.
I mean, even like the H1B, like what you and Benjamin were talking about in one of the recent Why Left episodes, and what like Vivek Ramaswamy and their whole like, this interesting, no, let's bring in smart immigrants to make America better, the contradiction and the tension between that sentiment, which kind of pairs well with the sentiment of the movie, like, no, let's bring people in and use their skills to make things better, versus like the Mexicans are taking our jobs. I don't know, like when they talk about this H-1B bill, they're talking about people from like China, India, countries like that, right?
We got to cut this
They're
off
not-
because we've got 7 people in the waiting room and Mikey's seminar starts in
I'll
2
just
minutes.
Let me finish my sentence. Yeah. They're not so much talking about like Mexican American immigrants. So it's just interesting, the immigration talk and the contradictions that exist within conservatism about it.
Perfect. All right, everybody. We'll be right back with the first hour of Mikey's seminar today, right after this. So don't go anywhere. It's going to be awesome. We're going to be doing a critique of therapism from the standpoint of psychoanalysis.
And thank you for listening. There's Ryan Gosling.
Hey, Ryan. That desk is wrecked.
Do not.
So that you can listen to special content that is not accessible to anyone else. Or if you go up a subscriber level, actually join in the discussions. Or at the top level, have us actually read your work, giving constructive feedback and ultimately paving a way to potentially being a part of what we call the turn. Then you'll want to become a subscriber. That's how you will access the ongoing courses and seminars. We've brought together Benjamin Studebaker's experience in political theory and science and philosophy with my critical social theory, phenomenology, existentialism, critique of political economy, critical media theory approach, combined with Michael Downes's fault line theory. You know, the CCRU versus Ljubljana School, or Žižek versus Land. And of course, how he brings those against one another and then transcends them through other thinkers like Baudrillard, who he'll be teaching an intro course to in 2025. All of us are teaching stuff in 2025 that rhymes or argues or goes together. And so the best way to accelerate your development getting into theory right now is to just become a subscriber at TU. Just go to the website, click get involved, and look, what I'm about to play for you all is a really special moment from our documentary that we're working on, an interview where Benjamin explains why he's supporting Theory Underground and getting involved as a active member here at the core of the teaching team.
Yeah, so the thing that I notice is that a lot of people criticize the university, they criticize the left, they don't build an alternative institution. They will go, the university sucks, but you know what's great? Substack and Patreon and YouTube, and they'll lean into that. But that is a negation, right? You guys don't do that. You guys are interested in sublating the university within the newly emergent media. Or you could frame it the other way, sublating the newly emergent media within the university, right? And so this, of course, will ultimately lead, if you take it where it goes, to a question of institutions and having economic, social role possibilities for theorists. This is the critical crisis, which is that there are still some very bright, very well-educated people, but they are not able to replace themselves. And because most of them have university positions, their level of interest in replacing themselves is to some degree compromised.
Yeah.
They don't have to worry that much about themselves. They don't have that much stake in it because they're already set up. However, because you aren't in the underground, you have some potential of being able to actually create an institution or structure which makes it possible for people to do theory in the future. This is something that, as far as I can tell, only you are doing.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Welcome back. We're about to, well, I'll hit the record button. Michael Downs, the seminar 2025, kicking off today. He's been going for, well, pretty much since July with the Mikey Downs seminar, but this is the sort of kickoff for 2025. Tomorrow is going to be Benjamin Studebaker's first ever seminar here at Theory Underground. And so you'll want to make sure to get in on that. The QR code for how to subscribe, it's on the screen, link in the description, blah, blah, blah. All I need to say as far as updates though, this is the month when all of the threads of the braid really kind of kick off, and it's very exciting. And Mikey's course, Sublime Object of Ideology, is going to become available to purchase as a standalone course. Unlike all the other courses at Theory Underground this year, Sublime Object of Ideology is something that you'll be able to purchase as a standalone. Though, of course, subscribers will have a discount that makes that very much like worthwhile. Okay, with all that said, Michael, how you doing, man?
Not too bad, not too bad. I had again, I always have this problem, Dave, where I end up having 3 or 4 things I could lecture on come seminar day. But today I opted to discuss superego. And yes, superego is one of these concepts I've discussed before. But as you know, I recently released a mega blog post on the superego. And this is something I wrote over a year and a half ago. And the post itself it's like over a 4-hour read. And but at the same time, it's only a fragment of this whole mega post that I've written that I think you're probably going to just turn into a book at some point if you have it your way. But I wanted to get this stretch of the part where I talk about the superego out, because I think it can benefit a lot of our students and fellow travelers, and mainly because I put in a lot of work. Like I actually went and word searched every single Lacan seminar for superego and dug out every single direct quote mention of it. And he actually doesn't talk about it as much as you think he would. And to me, I've said this before, I think superego is really Zizek's concept, at least the way that I use superego and understand it. It's really Zizek who took this insight from Lacan and really fleshed it out. Todd McGowan uses superego in this same kind of Zizekian way. And so superego's not as much a Freudian concept for me as it, or even really a Lacanian, even though, of course, Lacan's interpretation of it is what Zizek takes up and runs with. It's really a Zizekian McGowan concept. And I've talked about this is one of these situations where I'm not going to start from scratch. I always feel this duty, like, okay, I'm going to talk about superego. Let's do the basics again. I'm not going to. I feel like at this point, the seminar has been going long enough, and I'll just say this. I'll give like a 5-minute brief little summary in case somebody watching doesn't get it. But I want to get more into like the differences, the ways that I'm applying it, because what we're going to do here today is it's really superego and therapy culture, or superego and toxic positivity, or superego and therapism. And I feel like this is this unexplored dimension of how we can take this Lacanian, Zizekian, McGowan concept and make it alive for us in a way that maybe it isn't. And I get a lot of mileage out of this concept of superego, especially when it comes to therapy culture, because I think therapy culture at its most fundamental is superegoic. And that's a lot of the issue with it. However, there's certain Lacanian theorists who also are, they can simultaneously be critical of therapy culture and the ego psychology that really underpins it, that Lacan himself was critical of as he was working out his own psychoanalytic theory, ego psychology being this offshoot, and I would say it a mutilation of Freudian psychoanalysis, because it wants to privilege the building up of the ego, focusing on the ego. And it's odd, right? Like, how the hell does that become a default for any Freudian when Freudian psychoanalysis was always about reckoning with the unconscious? But a lot of Freud students, after they left Europe and came to America, they quickly realized that there's more money in building up people's self-esteem. And there's other reasons. This is kind of reductionistic, but the work of psychoanalysis is long and tedious, and it doesn't offer efficient, quick results. And there's other methods or treatments that can band-aid someone psychologically and build up their sense of ego and appeal to their self-image and all of this kind of stuff, which is you start turning therapy into the art of telling people what they want to hear, or you focus on everybody in their life is a victimizer and they're the victim, or you just simply try to build up and accelerate their fundamental desires or what they want, their ego ideals, the ideal images they have for their life. And this doesn't have anything to do with real Freudian psychoanalysis or Lacanian psychoanalysis, but it's a much easier commodity to sell. So what superegoic therapism does is it's not so much about building up the ego as much as trying to reinforce, celebrate the pursuit of one's enjoyment. And the problem is this creates a lot of unintended problems for the patient and for society as a whole. And so, yeah, I think superego for us is an incredibly important concept. I think it's more primary nowadays than the big other, and we can say that's a problem. And if briefly, the big other is this sense of social authority that tells us no, that wants to place limitations on ourselves, make us live in accordance with the reality principle. We can't always have it our way. We can't always get what we want. And there's a sense where the big other, guys like D&G will act like anything that tells you no is some sort of oppressor. But the Lacanian insight is no, sometimes the no, the limitation is actually a form of freedom. And when the superego comes in, which is, you can say it's the obscene flip side of the big other. Both of them are like generic social agency. If you guys know Heidegger, we're kind of talking about something like Dossmann here. It's the big generic self that guides us little selves when it comes to what we think we should be doing, achieving, being, enjoying, etc. It's the generic model upon which we individuals measure ourselves. And for Lacan, though, there's a split within this kind of generic social authority between the big other, which is the function of prohibition, of setting limits, right? And this other side that just says, yes, 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 enjoy, enjoy, enjoy. And this is the trick that Zizek especially sees in the law. Everybody thinks the law is always just a law of prohibition. And for him, the law is actually more brutal, more oppressive in the ways that it demands that we enjoy, that we celebrate, that we affirm our place in society, affirm society itself. These modes of demanded or coerced enjoyment are actually more oppressive than the more neutral agency that just simply says no and puts limitations on us. And so superego is this injunction to enjoy. That's the basic way of defining it. It is the law that actually demands us and commands enjoyment, opposed to self-sacrifice. And Zizek would probably argue, if we pushed him on it, that every law has both these sides, and even going all the way back to the Middle Ages, in ancient society. Because if you know Bataille is really good on this stuff of showing how there's these feasts that are based around excess in different societies, and they all have their ways of mediating the destruction of excess, right? For Zizek, these are places of inherent transgression, right? This is where the rule of the superego is really at work. The differences in these older societies is that the prohibitory function, the mediating function of no, you are a citizen, you have certain duties, those trump your enjoyment. Yes, there are times where we have feasts, certain seasons, certain rituals, but those have their spot. As far as normal everyday functionality, no, you cannot just enjoy, you cannot do whatever you want when you want. And so that's the trick of the law, is that the law, on the one hand, it has to impose regulations and rules and protocols and values and ideals for us to live up to that go against our radical idiosyncratic singularity, whatever our specific whims are, our desires are. We can't just do whatever we want, however we want, whenever we want. Okay, that's kind of that's the condition of being a member of society. But the trick is, the unconscious dimension is, there's also spots within every social order where there are forms of excessive enjoyment. What is unique to capitalism is that it makes these exceptional spots into a default setting. So instead of having, a certain religious ceremony or a certain feast that organizes or is an outlet for this kind of social enjoyment of the superegoic type, right? The type of jouissance that actually reinforces and reproduces a social order, as opposed to destroys it. It becomes an individual duty that we're all supposed to be pursuing all the time. And this has major bearing and pressure on the individual psyche, because it seems like it's a commandment to be free, when in fact it's more oppressive than the no, is the Lacanian Zizekian point. Because if you constantly have to be happy, you constantly have to be stimulated, you constantly have to be enjoying yourself, well, that's the surest way to fuck up your enjoyment. And to keep you invested in the cycle of consumption, the cycle of commodity accumulation, the cycle of keeping up with the Joneses, it spurs on consumerism. And this is why you see this collusion between the circuit of capital accumulation, MCM prime, and the superego. Both of them, to talk like Nick Land and the CCRU, these are cyber positive feedback loops. They bracket out the negative, right? They're more, accumulate. In the case of the capital, it's accumulate more capital. In the case of the superego, it's accumulate more enjoyment, enjoy more, have more enjoyment. Point is, the superego quickly becomes an impossible imperative. And that's where it becomes torturous. It's because none of us can be fucking happy all the time. And trying to be happy all the time is the surest way to zap our happiness, which makes us guilty in the eyes of the superego. So now we feel guiltier about ourselves. I'm not living my best life. I should be living happier. I should have more money. I should have a better body. I should be married by now. I should have a better, sex life. Whatever it is that each one of us thinks that we should have more, right? We beat ourselves to death. We browbeat ourselves with this shit, but it's not really us. It's this quiet but booming voice in the back of our head that's constantly telling us we're not enough. We haven't done enough. More, right? And the trick is, of course, is that this incessant pressure for us to live our best lives, to pursue enjoyment, who benefits from that? Capital. Because the only ways to really pursue this shit is by spending money. So if you think you need a better social life, you're going to have to go out to restaurants, you're going to have to go to bars, you're going to have to, go to sporting events or concerts. You're spending money. If you think you need to, I need to change things about myself so I can be more desirable to somebody. So you go to the gym and get a gym membership to get in better shape, or you want to buy better clothes and have a better sense of style. All of these various tactics that capitalism employs are superegoic. They're fueled by this relentless pressure to live your best life as if simply enjoying is the end all be all to human existence. No, it is for the consumer existence, but it's not for the human existence. And there is a difference there. Okay, that hopefully is sufficient enough just for a little generic intro to the superego. Okay. So what I want to say here is that, and this is something that I was inspired by Dwayne Roussel in this regard. Dwayne has some really good stuff in, let me get the exact title here. He's written many books, and I'm not sure which one I was pulling this from here. Yeah, it's his Jacques Lacan and American Sociology. Be Weary of the Image. So Dwayne does this great thing where he talks about American wisdom as these little short bursts of wisdom. Now, these are close to what we think of as like, self-help memes, positivity memes, right? Little bits of inspirational advice, inspirational memes. And this is key, right? Because what you find is that the superego, it demands us to enjoy, but it itself isn't a master of enjoyment. This is what makes it similar to the big other. The big other does tell us that there's certain rules and meanings and values within society that it itself provides. But what you find is that the big other is also lacking meaning. There's always signifiers missing. Now, the Lacanian way of talking about the signifier of the barred other. Yeah. All it means is that a social order isn't able to make sense of everything that's happening, that there's gaps within it, right? Well, the gap in the superego is that the superego itself is no master of enjoyment. It doesn't know how to tell us how to perfectly enjoy ourselves. It just gives us the imperative to do so and then leaves us on our fucking own. And yeah, you have a duty to enjoy, but you fucking figure it out. And of course, this is presented like personal freedom. I'm not telling you what to do. You're free to pursue and experiment and find your own forms of enjoyment. Yeah, what it means is that you leave us fucking high and dry because you really don't tell us how to have perfect enjoyment. And the trick is we can't. So, but there's a way around this because even though the superego doesn't have like perfect knowledge of enjoyment and can't present a systematic knowledge of jouissance of how to perfectly enjoy, what it can do in Baudrillardian terms is simulate a kind of body of enjoyment wisdom, right? And this is what these inspirational memes, little self-help memes really do, right? They give you little clues on what to go on, but never a systematic, concise, cohesive vision of or an authoritative manual on how to actually enjoy, right? So let me give you little examples, right, of this kind of stuff. Life's too short to be anything but happy. One small positive thought in the morning can change your whole day. Always believe that something wonderful is about to happen. Let whatever you do today be enough. Don't let anything dull your sparkle. Only have people in your life that always make you smile. There is always something to be thankful for. All you need is love and good coffee. You can always find a million reasons to love life and be happy. Always find time for the things that make you feel happy to be alive. If you don't have power to make someone smile, if you have the power to make someone smile, do it. I'm all about good vibes, big goals, amazing experiences, and more happiness. A negative mind will never give you a positive life. The problem is not the problem. The problem is your attitude about the problem. Ugh. Sorry for that, guys. Okay, so I want to run through a couple of these because what I did in my post, and look, sometimes you guys, the lectures have different feels because I structure them differently. This one, I got to kind of go off the post. And so I'm going to read some quotes. Other ones, I just bullet point, and other ones I just kind of freestyle. But this one's, because it is based on the posts I wrote, I'm going to just kind of read little excerpts here or there, because how do I say it better than I already said? I don't know. So look, okay. So as far as these little sound bites of enjoyment wisdom go, lurking behind the seemingly harmless facade of inspirational memes is the diabolical superego. Notice how none of them address the material conditions in which people actually exist. There's no mention of wage labor, structural exploitation, lack of money, lack of time energy. All right, kids, let's fucking do this. It's time to break out the they live glasses and rip apart this superegoic ideological bullshit. I want to briefly reflect on 4 of these little pieces of wisdom. All right, so the first one is life's too short to be anything but happy. First off, happiness is rarely attained, and that temporary attainment is very fleeting. Freudian Lacanian psychoanalysis, with its concept of the death drive, has revealed prolonged happiness to be nothing more than the production of fantasy. If happiness with a capital H is impossible, then it would be torturous to make it the main goal of human existence, which is precisely what the superego does. The superego's enjoy means happiness is impossible, therefore I command you to be perfectly happy. Kant said ought implies can, but the sadistic superego says ought implies can't. To be happy all the time is really to be to not be alive at all. Pure happiness is anti-life. Sorry, but happiness is a terrible ideal to measure life by. This is the true nihilism. It's very easy to argue that one has never truly liked, or it's very easy to argue that one has never truly lived without having ever had your heart broken, without confronting the darkest dimensions of the world, without tarrying with the negative in all its myriad forms. The ideology of work in this statement, the ideology at work in this statement is this. It attempts to keep us focused on the futural specter of an impossible happiness, and that keeps us from reckoning with the actual material conditions in the here and now. What we have is a modern and personalized version of the classic two-world ideology that both Marx and Nietzsche critiqued. The only difference is that this fantasy of happiness locates the attainment of it in our imminent reality, capitalist society, as opposed to a transcendent one, heaven, the afterlife, etc. The pursuit of happiness is one of the opiums of the people. Fuck the ideal of the happy life if it blinds us to life itself. I curse this little chunk of life wisdom in the name of life itself. Okay, so that's what a lot of these are going to do. And we can look at a couple more. But they put this insane pressure on us to live our best lives and be happy without factoring in what the fuck is going on in our jobs, in the economy, in culture. They totally are de-worlded abstract forms of life affirmation. And they do not factor in the material conditions. And this is the problem of so much of therapy culture nowadays. And Mark Fisher knew this better than anybody. His writings on depression and therapy are some of his best, in my opinion. And it's because he understood, the neoliberal, therapy is neoliberal ideology because it makes everything about changing your attitude, having the right disposition, blah, blah, blah. What if my fucking world sucks? What if my material conditions fucking suck, right? And this is where someone like Heidegger is relevant, because Heidegger offers us a theory of mood, and it's a little more, nuanced than that, but just hear me out. He gives us a theory of mood that doesn't make moods like distortions. Most philosophers tend to view moods as these great distorting elements. And so they've always downplayed the role of emotion and, privileged reason or privileged empirical experience. But they always try to bracket out emotions, like somehow emotions pollute or contaminate empirical experience or reason. Whereas Heidegger's like, no, moods are fundamentally revelatory. They're fundamentally tapped in to truth. And sure, he's not saying that that emotions can't get tangled up or distort sometimes, but as a default setting, your attunement to the world is typically revealing certain aspects of the world. You're not attuning yourself to false reality. You're attuning yourself to the disclosure of your horizon, right? It's the way that the world is showing itself to you. And so somebody who is clinically depressed, right, from a Heideggerian perspective, maybe it's because they're attuned to something in their world. Maybe that mood is not some irrational bit of mind poison that we need to medicate away. Maybe it's actually revealing the fucking world itself. And so that's where Mark Fisher would, they're all on the same page in the sense of therapy just wants to blame the individual, ignore the structural, ignore the societal, and it fundamentally relies on this assumption like, well, we can't change anything at the structural level, so you need to just make everything about your personal endeavor to change your fucking attitude. Fuck you. I want society to change. And then they'll try to play the game. Oh, see, that's a way of just ignoring your personal responsibility. Yeah. Superego loves to browbeat you with your fucking personal responsibility. Like you're supposed to just build your world up from scratch. That you don't have any facticity, and the world itself doesn't have any facticity, any givenness, any brute, this is what it's aboutness about it. No, you're thrown into a world. You're thrown into a set of circumstances beyond your control. And if you, like many others in our society, find these to be very depressing conditions to be thrown into, that's a danger to society. If everybody starts forming solidarity based around these forms of attunement. So you have to fragment them. You have to individualize them. And this type of atomization that therapy culture does is effective capitalist ideology, because if you get everybody thinking that it's just their individual psyche that's the problem, you will tune them out to structural dynamics and material conditions. And the big voice of the superego that's just spurring you on to enjoy more and consume more and be happy, this is the voice of capital, right? They really can view the voice of superego as the voice of capital. And this is why it is important to not listen to the dogmatic Lacanian clinicians who think all this shit is only applicable within the four walls of the clinic. No, superego is not just some idiosyncratic dimension of the analysis process. It is the voice of capital itself, MCM prime. And so, that has a broader effect than the idiosyncratic dynamics of one's personal development that one would go over in the clinic. So, transgress the law of the clinic, take these concepts and see how they work in society, because they're going to give you a lot to go on. They're going to shed a lot of fucking light on things. And the ones who would have us, those who would forbid us from taking these clinical concepts and applying them on a broader scope, can't help but feel like they're doing capital a favor. So that's my issue with that whole thing. So, okay. But there's a couple more of these pieces of wisdom I want to touch on. So let's see. Let's see. Yeah, here's one. Let's mention the one with our mentions our good buddy here. Always find time for the things that make you feel happy to be alive. Now the superego is telling us to always find time to do the things that make us happy. Fuck off. Wage labor is what eats our time and energy alive. It's impossible to find time when the work week is structured in such a way as to make that task impossible. Find what amount of happy time during my shitty wage labor work day. 3 fucking milliseconds worth? Will that be enough? Is that sufficient, superego? Hell no. You gotta be a lot happier than that. The last piece of wisdom essentially claimed that we don't need money in order to be happy. But now this one is telling us always find time to be happy. The last piece that I didn't read this one. All you need is love and good coffee. I guess you don't need money. I guess you don't need time, energy, just love and coffee. Isn't that wonderful? That's so sweet. Well, some of us need fucking money, and some of us need time, fucking energy. Those things, vast life improvers. Not because they establish some perfect sublime state. They don't. They never will. It's not about that. It's because they make your dissatisfaction bearable. They give you a tolerable existence, opposed to one that is pressurized insufferableness, pathological insufferableness, right? So, but this is what you get with this kind of American wisdom, right? Wisdom. These little pieces of inspirational bullshit, they're contradictory as fuck. All you have to do is get a list of them and line them up and start thinking through them and go, that one's inconsistent with that one. That one's bullshit because of this one. But if this one's true, then that one's bullshit. It's easy to pick this shit apart. You don't have to be a philosopher or a critic of ideology to see through this bullshit. Any normie can pick these apart. But that's precisely why they never post them in big lists, right? It's just one at a time, because you focus on the one, it sounds good, warm and fuzzy, nothing behind it. No depth, no substance, right? So this is what makes it wisdom. And the reason Dwayne is using wisdom in this way is because of how Zizek uses wisdom. Zizek is not against knowledge of, knowledge of life or insights that give us, ways to understand and cognize situations. That's what he's been doing his whole life. What he doesn't like about wisdom, and maybe you can say, well, you should use a different word because wisdom's a good word. Okay, fine. But what he's talking about, the referent to what he's talking about, are these kind of like sophists that, wise men that will come up. Zizek's example is Job's 3 friends in the book of Job. Job loses everything. And then these 3 assholes come along and they just start going, well, if you had done this, it wouldn't have gone like that. And if you do this, or you should have tried this. And the funny thing is God shows up at the end and is like, these 3 cocksuckers over here are so talking out of their fucking asses. They don't know a goddamn thing about what's going on, right? And it's this that gets Zizek to not like wisdom. Because, his examples that, this is like Zizek shtick material. But if you ever get him, you ask him about him, he'll say like, the great example is like a sophist or a wise man who says to you on the one hand, like, if you try something bold and you succeed in what you're trying to do, then the wise man will say, fortune favors the bold, right? But if you try something bold and risky and it fails, then the wise man will tell you, don't ever try to piss against the wind. Dude, you make yourself sound deep and you didn't do anything. You're just reacting to the results of taking a bold leap. And guess what? Here's the truth. Bold leaps, are fucking risky. So sometimes you're going to maybe you'll succeed. You'll probably not. But the point is, the dude's not fucking wise for stating the obvious in some flowery, wise sounding way. It's just bullshit. And underlying all that is be happy, enjoy, get it right. And that's really like the superego. A way to translate the enjoy is get it right. Get it right. Always get it right. Never fuck it up. Get it right. Well, fuck you. We're going to fuck it up. We're not going to get it right. And that's okay. But it's not okay when you're trying to spur people on to keep consuming and keep clicking and liking and tuning in. So the economy itself is super egoic in that way. So, okay. So yeah, the last piece of wisdom essentially claimed that we don't need money, just coffee and love in order to be happy. But now this one is telling us to always find time for happiness. So now time is important. Notice how the economic factor is totally left out of this equation. This brings us to what David McKerracher calls time energy. Quote, this is from Waypoint. We are all deprived of time energy. Our society revolves around the commodification or exchange of labor power, which is what time energy becomes in capitalism. Time energy is existentially prior to the economic divorce and separation of time from energy, which is to say the alienation of time from energy and the alienation of energy from time. Time energy is not just time or energy, but comes before the compartmentalization of either, which for whatever fucking reason, the Marxists we love can't process this thought. They just can't process this thought, okay? Time energy is energy plus time, with the potential to repeatedly sacrifice towards building sustained, symbolic, and material value for oneself and potential communities of recognition and care. In the Baudrillardian sense, time energy is tied up with symbolic exchange, which is the production of meaningful bonds and connections and values that are not commodity values, that are not market values, that are not wage labor values. And guess what? They have their own rhythm to them. They have their own pulse to them. They do not synchronize. They are not efficient. They have a life of their own. And whatever rhythm you have with one person in your symbolic exchange is not going to be the rhythm you have with somebody else. And some symbolic bonds can be maintained where you guys only talk once a year, and others have to be cultivated on a weekly basis. Each singular relationship or symbolic exchange is just that. It's singular. And it doesn't fit in to the abstract laws of commodity value. And that is why Baudrillard points out it is always suppressed. Symbolic exchange is suppressed wherever value, and by value he means exchange value, use value, sign value, the three modes of value that make up commodity value, right? So for him, symbolic exchange is anti-value in the sense of it's value that is not, that does not conform to the law of commodity value. Okay, so Dave goes on to say, put under the sign of the law of value, time energy is structurally suppressed, retooled, and co-opted in its most basic sense. That which had previously been time energy is now labor power. Labor power is what time energy gets turned into. They're not the same thing. Labor power, I would say, is the perversion of time energy. Again, Marxists have real trouble understanding this, whereas normies and everybody else seem to be able to grasp it. Isn't that funny? It gets turned into a commodity, something that must be exercised towards economic ends, in place of the various symbolic and material modes of coexistence or domination previously experienced by humans who did not count their every minute in the day. Subjectivities formed within capitalism learn early on to measure their worlds in terms of universal exchangeability, which is to say the abstract law of value, the form of value imposed on all things by capital itself and by the market. And time energy, if we are going to ever have our time energy, cannot be made subservient to the law of value. It has to escape the law of the commodity form of value. That is the ultimate goal here, because this idea of somehow we'll just control the commodity form of value, if one thing has been proven, it's that we do not control it, it controls us. So however we seek in the future to fight for time energy, we have to keep in mind that one, it does not exist in accordance with commodity value, and two, and there's the other point, it is not superegoic. Time energy is not about enjoying more and more and more and more. Oh, if I just have my time energy, I'll finally get to say YOLO. No, time energy is not about hyper positivity. And I think this is how certain Lacanians might critique us, is they might claim that we're being superegoic in the sense of, well, you guys say if you have that special substance called time energy, then everybody will be able to enjoy. No, they'll just be able to struggle better. They'll be able to struggle with negativity better. And better is not perfect. Better is not impossible. So we got to be careful when we talk about progress, right? Because do we mean utopian progress where all problems are solved and everybody fully enjoys and there's no social contradictions anymore? No. That is not what I mean by better. That is not what Dave means by better. That is not what Theory Underground means by better. And so better is actually more negativity, not in the pessimistic sense, not in the doomer sense, but in the sense of being able to have the time and energy to reckon with more contradictions in your world, with more frictions or inconsistencies, and being able to dwell in those and see what they do for you, right? As a person and as a social being. So yeah, okay. Right now, I'm limited in what I can do. Wouldn't it be amazing if I could actually reckon with mathematics or truly reckon with various forms of art that I don't have time to like focus on right now? Like the more that you reckon with these things and challenge them and get challenged by them, the fuller you can develop as a subject. Not because it makes you full or complete or absolutely, no, because it deepens contradiction, which is how I would talk about the progression or the bettering of the self, but not to some sort like I've been reading some of the occult literature because of Nick Land and CCRU stuff, and you guys probably know him, Aleister Crowley, most famous occultist who ever lived. I think that's fair to say. His whole thing with his form of occultism, which he called Thelema, is that ultimately it's about attaining your true self, your unified, pure self. Now, I'm open to this idea, and the superego takes it. Like it's super egoic in a sense. Because for me, I don't think there's a true self to actualize. Now, I might sometimes slip into talking about a true self, but it's a radically different type of thing than what Crowley, like the universe itself just gives you a self to live up to or something. No, if I was to talk about a truth self, what I would mean is there's all sorts of ways that you as an individual can become attuned to your situation, your moment in history, right? And there's all kinds of ways that you can facilitate reckoning, tearing with your situation in ways that elevate, in ways that show the world new things, make a contribution to the world, right? But these selves, first off, they're contingent. They're going to be dependent on your facticity. They're not transcendent, locked away in some other dimension that somehow, if I get the spiritual means to access, I will tap into my one true self given to the universe. No. What you can do is you have certain contingent potentials that, if developed in certain ways, could become drives that you latch onto in passion and you can repeat. And the point is, we can talk about true selves without doing this transcendent true self shit. We can talk about imminent true selves that are contingent and realistic and not mystical. They're very worldly grounded things that are based on our existential proclivities and our libidinal economies. There's a whole configuration of factors that go into this. But what I mean by a true self is an imminent worldly calling that your little libidinal economy is spontaneous. It's not purely spontaneous, but it seems spontaneously invested in repeating and cultivating, right? So this is basically a long-winded way of me talking about how being a philosopher is my true self without doing the Crowley thing of thinking like somehow my holy guardian angel I got to communicate with and have conversation with, and now somehow my deep self is revealed. No. So this is this idea of the true self, the way that spiritualist traditions use it, can be hyper super egoic because it's ultimately something you can't achieve, you can't access. You can have faith that you can do it and keep trying, but I think there's better ways to have a self than that. Okay, so and then just Albert Camus has a couple quotes that really supplement Dave nicely on time energy. So I like reading these two quotes from Camus along with Dave's quote. In Happy Death, Camus says, Only it takes time to be happy, a lot of time. Happiness, too, is a long patience. And in almost every case, we use up our lives making money when we should be using our money to gain time. That's the only problem that's ever interested me. To have money is to have time. That's my point. Time can be bought. Everything can be bought. To be or to become rich is to have time to be happy if you deserve it. Okay. And then he also says in Myth of Sisyphus, a man wants to earn money in order to be happy, and his whole effort and the best of a life are devoted to the earning of that money. Happiness is forgotten. The means are taken for the end. So this Camus tapped into how money and the commodity mechanisms and capitalism really actually get in the way of us having the main thing we need. And yes, he just talks about time. Dave's the one who figured out the time energy connection. But Camus, if he heard Dave, he'd go, yeah, add energy into that. I should have said that, right? So, okay. So in truth, I need money in order to have time energy, and I need time energy in order to be happy in any sense of the term. But I can only get money by sacrificing my time energy, which in turn means sacrificing my happiness. The superego, once again, is bombarding us with an impossible injunction. Always have time energy and happiness without money being an issue at all. In other words, do not complain about one's material conditions, one's economic facticity, and instead always find time to enjoy no matter what. Pure torture in the guise of uplifting wisdom. So we're keeping it a little shorter today. Dave, if you want to chime in, I know you probably have a lot to say on this. Yep.
Okay, now they can hear me on the live stream side as well. So yeah, I just wanted to say, man, I always trip up on this because we use this like pretty rigid heuristic by separating desire from drive and really accentuating that drive is rebelling against desire. It's rebelling against the pleasure principle. And my issue every time it like the way that we talk about this never clicks into place with this specific way of talking about the superego, because enjoy, in most of the quotes that you're quoting, this is about the pleasure principle. Society is not telling you to road rage. Society is not telling you to gamble. Society is not telling you to binge eat. It's saying enjoy within moderation, which is the pleasure principle. No?
No, here you want the accurate thing of what I think the superego is doing when it says enjoy. It means both pleasure and jouissance at the same time, which is even more torturous or impossible. It wants, when it says enjoy, and I know that the Lacanian thing is to say it's talking about jouissance, and I'm with you. I think it's a little more nuanced, and I think it's a little bit harsher than just, enjoy self-destructive activity. No, it means have the best of all modes of enjoyment. So the real thing is, no, when you go to the restaurant you love, pig the fuck out, don't hold back, live life to the fullest. Also, keep working on that six-pack. Like it's both. Have it all. Like that. When I hear enjoyment, when I say it means get it right, it also means have it all.
Okay.
So don't restrain yourself in your diet, but keep those six-pack abs. Fuck fuck, dude. Like, but that's what society wants. It wants us to have the great bodies and to have money and to be successful, but it also doesn't want us to hold back or restrain. It wants us to do it all. Well, fuck you. That is not the reality principle. So I just think, for me, the way I read it, I want to read into enjoy, meaning pleasure and jouissance.
All right. Now, we said we were going to cut this off at the halfway point. I think it's too late to do that, but we will cut it off right now for the live viewers. Folks, if you want to be in here, At the next one of these that will not be live, well, then the PSA that I'm about to roll will tell you how to get involved. This was like a sneak peek into the Mikey seminar. Most of these don't happen publicly, but it was great to have you all here. Live chat. Take care, everybody, in the future. Take care. Peace. Bye. Everyone wave bye-bye to the live people. Bye, TV land.
You could become so that you can listen to special content that is not accessible to anyone else. Or if you go up a subscriber level, actually join in the discussions. Or at the top level, have us actually read your work, giving constructive feedback and ultimately paving a way to potentially being a part of what we call the turn. Then you'll want to become a subscriber. That's how you will access the ongoing courses and seminars. We've brought together Benjamin Studebaker's experience in political theory and science and philosophy with my critical social theory, phenomenology, existentialism, critique of political economy, critical media theory approach, combined with Michael Downes's fault line theory. You know, the CCRU versus Ljubljana School, or Žižek versus Land. And of course, how he brings those against one another and then transcends them through other thinkers like Baudrillard, who he'll be teaching an intro course to in 2025. All of us are teaching stuff in 2025 that rhymes or argues or goes together. And so the best way to accelerate your development getting into theory right now is to just become a subscriber at TU. Just go to the website, click get involved, and I'm gonna look, this, what I'm about to play for you all is a really special moment from our documentary that we're working on. An interview where Benjamin explains why he's supporting Theory Underground and getting involved as a active member here at the core of the teaching team.
Yeah, so the thing that I notice is that a lot of people criticize the university, they criticize the left, they don't build an alternative institution. They will go, the university sucks, but you know what's great? Substack and Patreon and YouTube, and they'll lean into that. But that is a negation, right? You guys don't do that. You guys are interested in sublating the university within the newly emergent media. Or you could frame it the other way, sublating the newly emergent media within the university, right? And so this, of course, will ultimately lead, if you take it to a question of institutions and having actual economic, social role possibilities for theorists. This is the critical crisis, which is that there are still some very bright, very well-educated people, but they are not able to replace themselves. And because most of them have university positions, their level of interest in replacing themselves is to some degree compromised.
Yeah.
They don't have to worry that much about themselves. They don't have that much stake in it because they're already set up. However, because you aren't in the underground, you have some potential of being able to actually create an institution or structure which makes it possible for people to do theory in the future. This is something that, as far as I can tell, only you are doing. The thing about freeing Mikey from wage labor, this idea not only that your channel would free you from the Amazon job, but that this could grow in such a way that it could provide spaces for multiple people, and then those multiple people could interact in the way that they would in a monastery or in a university department. This is the revolutionary idea in terms of raising consciousness and making it possible for us to think in such a way that we could return even to the horizons of the tens and talking about things like Medicare for all in a not stupid, not bullshit way, in a serious way. To get to that point, we need to raise our level of ability to think. We need new intellectuals in our generation that are real intellectuals and not people who are running around scared of what the DSA or their university department thinks of them. You have the potential to actually make a real material intervention into not just knowledge production, but in Bildung, into the making of people. Yeah. This is something that that we can do. There's a window right now where I am not in the university, and so I have a real reason to think very seriously about, can we do something else? Because I'm annoyed, myself with the whole process of trying to be in that. And I would like there to be something else, something better. I have all my critiques of it that come in part from being at Cambridge, in part from studying ancient thinkers. We could do something better than it. Not just something that is an imitation or steals some things from it and does the best you can with it, but something that actually is better and that produces the kind of theory that in modernity, how do you make a Hegel? How do you make a Marx? We have to reinvent this. It's no longer possible to do that. We've got to, I think, actually institutionalize in a material way, and this is the sense in which I will uphold the kernel of materialism, actually giving a shit about the structure and what kind of structure is necessary to give rise to a form of life in which this kind of really, really good work can be produced.